Hey guys, tonight we're headed somewhere grimy, drafty and absolutely soaked in bad decisions. Tudor England. Yep, we're talking corsets, codpieces and chamber pots. But this isn't your standard tour through castles and crowns. No, tonight we're diving into why sex, specifically for women, was basically a long, uncomfortable, confusing nightmare in the 16th century. And look, I'll level with you. You probably won't survive this. Not because of war or famine or whatever, though sure, those are all very real. But because you're likely to die giving birth at 17 or get executed for having the wrong kind of crush. Romantic, right? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your city and what time it is down in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're watching from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in the chill grey half-light of a Tudor morning. Your first sensation is dampness, and not the nice kind. The mattress is stuffed with straw, thin and clumped, and smells faintly of mildew and feet. Your linen sheets, if you're lucky enough to have them, are stiff with age, occasionally patched and questionably stained. And no, you're not alone, not even close. Your little siblings sleep beside you, your mother snores on the other side of the room, and if you're a servant, you might be sharing space with a few others and maybe a goat or two. So if you're thinking sex is private, intimate, or even clean, think again. Let's start with the basics. There's no running water, and unless you're mega rich, you're not bathing regularly. Maybe once a week, maybe once a month, probably less. Your hair has been perfumed, but not washed. Your body? Scrubbed with a rough cloth maybe, but still crusty with old sweat and that deeply medieval musk. Deodorant hasn't been invented. Perfume? Sure. But it's mostly used to mask the smell of rot, poop and illness. You sleep in your undergarments, or naked, and reuse them for days. The linens don't get washed often either. If they do though, it's in a river downstream from a tannery. So really, good luck with that. You shuffle outside and, if you're a woman, your day is full of fetching water, cooking, scrubbing, birthing, or, if you're noble, embroidering by candlelight and trying to avoid eye contact with the drunk nobleman who will probably propose in iambic pentameter. Either way, your sexuality is not your own. You're a commodity. Your purity has actual cash value. And if you're not married by 15, people start whispering. If you are married, sex is a duty, a way to provide heirs or demonstrate loyalty. It's rarely for pleasure, especially for you. One actual historical fact, in Tudor law the age of consent was 12 for girls. 12. Which means many marriages happened well before the poor girl even knew what was going on. A noble bride might be married young and sent to her husband's household for training. Think less romantic honeymoon and more awkward hostage situation. The fringe fact? There were records of some women trying to escape this fate by faking illnesses, pretending to have visions, or even dressing as men to live outside the system. Those cases were rare, risky, and often ended poorly. But they happened. That's how desperate some women were to avoid becoming another body under another man's control. Now, let's not pretend this whole marriage and sex thing was a joyful leap into adulthood for the boys either. Sure, men had more legal and social power, but Tudor sex education was non-existent for them too. Most young men entered marriage with a weird mix of street law, Latin religious warnings, and the kind of poetry that suggested women were angelic vessels or demonic temptress. Basically, total confusion. But for women, it wasn't just confusing, it was terrifying. You were expected to obey, submit, and produce. Your family had pinned their hopes, and sometimes their financial futures, on your marriage. You had one job: marry well, stay loyal, and crank out as many healthy male heirs as your body could manage before it gave up on you entirely. Love? Optional. Pleasure? Not even discussed. In fact, if you enjoyed it too much, people might start throwing around the word whore. And here's where things get even more uncomfortable. Scholarly debate still circles around how normal people actually viewed sex and intimacy in this era. Was there room for affection, mutual desire, even love? Some letters and private diaries suggest yes, but they're scarce and mostly written by the upper classes. For most women, especially the poor, there wasn't much room to reflect on feelings. You were too busy surviving. So the idea of sexual agency or preference or identity, that was a luxury you didn't get. You might think, well, maybe noble women had it better? Not really. Sure, they had slightly softer beds and slightly better soap, but they were even more tightly monitored. Every movement, every look, every touch was political. A flirtation could be treason. An affair, lethal. Just ask Anne Boleyn. One wrong word and your head might roll, literally. And unlike the peasants, noblewomen didn't have the anonymity of the village. Everyone knew your business, everyone judged. So no matter your station, sex in Tudor England wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous, confusing, and overwhelmingly one-sided. You're taught to be pregnant, obedient, grateful. And you do all this while dealing with lice, unwashed bodies, stained sheets, and a mattress that sags like a boat taking on water. But hey, this is just the beginning. We haven't even gotten to the terrifying medical theories, the utterly broken concept of consent, or the part where you might actually be accused of witchcraft for enjoying yourself. So curl in tight, hold your nose, and brace yourself for what's next. Drag yourself through another raw-boned Tudor morning, the kind where the mist clings to everything and your joints already ache, even though you're not even 30. Maybe you're lucky enough to be inside a house with glazed windows, tiny bubbled glass panes that distort the world like you're living behind old ice. But more likely you're waking up in a timber-framed hovel, where the only window is a wooden shutter you push open to let the stink out. There's no breeze, just the thick sour smell of sweat, boiled cabbage, soot, and something else you try not to name. Now let's talk about hygiene, or more specifically, the spectacular lack of it. In Tudor England, washing your body was not a daily activity. Not even close. Public bathhouses had been popular in earlier centuries, but by now they were mostly shut down or considered suspicious. Hotbeds of sin and disease. After all, soaking naked with strangers didn't sit well with a culture that thought pleasure was inherently immoral. So washing went out of fashion, along with any hope of feeling clean again. Instead of a nice morning shower or even a splash of cold water from a tap, which of course doesn't exist, you're probably doing a token face and hands rinse with freezing water from a wooden bucket. Maybe you'll scrub up your pits with a linen rag, but that's if you're fancy. Soap is expensive, baths are rare, whole body washing might happen once a month or once a season or on your wedding day. And it's not like you're sweating less. Last more. Your daily life involves hard labour, tight clothes, and multiple layers, all without breathable fabrics. So yes, you and everyone around you are stewing in a slow-cooked broth of body odour and grime. What's wild is that some people actually believed bathing was dangerous. There was a popular medical theory floating around called the miasma theory, the idea that bad smells carried disease. Ironically, people thought soaking in hot water opened your pores and made you more vulnerable to these foul airs. So the logical conclusion? Better to stay dirty and sealed up than risk catching the plague from a bath. And yet, somehow, you're still expected to get married, consummate that marriage, and live happily ever after. Which is a lot to ask when your partner hasn't bathed in weeks, has fleas, and possibly carries a few unidentifiable rashes. Your bed is a lumpy straw-filled sack strung across a wooden frame with ropes. And yes, that's where the phrase sleep tight comes from. They literally had to tighten the ropes to keep the bed from sagging too much. The mattress? A living ecosystem of insects, dust, sweat, and probably a few stains from your neighbour who used it last year. So imagine this, you're lying there, trying to summon even a flicker of interest while someone climbs on top of you in the dark, grunting, sweaty, and definitely not freshly scrubbed. There's no candle, because candles are expensive, just the vague shape of someone who smells like pickled onions and unwashed wool. The act itself is probably awkward, silent, and over in about a minute. And you're expected to lie back and think of England, or at least pretend it's fine. Now here's a legit historical fact. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly had a bath once a month, whether she needed it or not. That was considered luxurious. The average person wouldn't see that kind of indulgence. And even noblewomen who had access to basins and bathing rooms rarely used them. They relied on perfumes, scented gloves, and linen chemises changed daily to absorb sweat. Basically, layer up and pretend you don't reek. Here's your fringe detail of the night. Urine. Yep, some folks actually used urine to clean their clothes and even their skin. Aged urine, specifically, let it sit and ferment, then use it as a kind of medieval bleach. The ammonia in it broke down stains. It was also believed to treat acne, so while you're curled up by the hearth with your rough woolen stockings, You might be rubbing pee on your face and calling it a beauty routine. And this is where we start to see the deep contradiction. On one hand, the Tudors were obsessed with cleanliness in a symbolic moral sense. Clean soul, clean spirit. But physical cleanliness? That was suspicious, especially for women. If you spent too much time on your appearance, washing, perfuming, plucking, you were vain, possibly sinful, maybe even inviting temptation. And if you didn't do it at all, you were a filthy peasant, or worse, a scold. There was no winning. Scholars still debate how much ordinary people cared about physical hygiene. Some records suggest rural folks kept clean in practical ways, cold river dips in summer, brisk cloth rubs in winter, but city dwellers were often caked in soot, dust, and who knows what else. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Lack of hygiene led to lice, scabies and open sores, and that's before we even get to the rats. You try feeling sexy with fleas in your armpits and a boil on your hip. Now, the thing that really seals the deal is this. In an age where most people never saw a toothbrush, the breath situation was apocalyptic. Teeth were rarely brushed, sometimes rubbed with soot or cloth, and people regularly suffered from toothworms, which, yes, they actually believed existed and caused cavities. So your romantic partner probably had bad breath, visible rot, and maybe a few missing molars. And they're leaning in close. This all matters because sex, at least consensual sex, requires some level of attraction, right? Physical comfort, some idea of mutual interest, or even just not being actively repulsed. But in Tudor England, those factors barely registered. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about obligation, reproduction, property, and alliances. You didn't get to be choosy. You didn't get to say no. You just shut your eyes and tried not to gag. And here's the kicker. If you didn't want to sleep with your husband, too bad. Marriage made sex legally mandatory. Marital rape wasn't even a concept. Your body belonged to him. Full stop. You could be dead tired, sick, grieving. It didn't matter. He could demand his conjugal rights and you were expected to comply. Even if the bed felt like a torture device and the whole room stank of onions, fire smoke and old beer. So no, bathing wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about power, health, status and control. And the fact that it was largely absent, that made every intimate encounter a sensory disaster, and for women, a deeply unequal one. Just another reminder that in Tudor England, you weren't the main character of your own story. You were the property, the vessel, the afterthought. So go ahead and shiver a little under the covers. We've got a long, sweaty, awkward journey ahead, and it only gets weirder from here. It's your wedding night and you're terrified. Not just because your new husband smells like smoked herring and cheap ale, but because no one has told you anything useful about what's about to happen. You've spent your whole life being warned to be modest, pure and silent. Sex is a mystery wrapped in Latin, disguised in poetry, and whispered about in corners, like it's some forbidden spell. You've heard stories, sure, half of them terrifying, the other half so vague they might as well be about ghosts. What you know for sure is that whatever happens next is going to hurt, and you're supposed to be okay with that. Welcome to Tudor Sex Education, an elegant mix of superstition, ignorance, and misogyny. No books for you, especially if you're a woman. Your lessons might come from your mother, who blushes and mumbles about duty and quo, or maybe from an older maid who begils behind her hand and gives you terrible advice involving goose fat and lying still. If you're a man, maybe you sneak a peek at a classical medical text, written in Latin of course, where female anatomy is described as a sort of inverted male body. That's right. Some medical thinkers at the time believed women were just inside-out men. That's how little they understood the basics. And if you're expecting any sort of helpful anatomical diagram, good luck. Most illustrations are decorative, symbolic, and completely useless. One famous book from the era includes a picture of a naked woman standing like a statue, a weirdly symmetrical fetus drawn inside her belly like a pumpkin carving. No explanation, no instructions, just vibes. You could stare at that woodcut for an hour and come away with more questions than answers. There's a real historical fact for you. The vast majority of Tudor-era medical knowledge came from ancient sources, Galen, Hippocrates, Aristotle, all of whom had some creative ideas. They thought women were naturally colder and wetter than men, which somehow made them less rational, and that orgasms were necessary for conception. Yes, they actually believed women needed to climax in order to become pregnant. So if you couldn't get pregnant, that was probably your fault for not trying hard enough to enjoy yourself. The logic was almost impressively bad. And here's your quirky sidebar of the night. Some midwives believed a woman could become pregnant just by dreaming about a man, or by looking at something sexy for too long. Lustful thoughts were dangerous, especially if you didn't have a husband, because if you were a single woman and got horny, that meant your womb might start wandering, literally. They thought the womb could detach and float around your body, choking your organs. It was called suffocation of the mother, and it was considered both a medical emergency and a moral failure. You were sick because you were impure. Hooray for science. But back to your big night. The room is small and several people might be watching. No, seriously, noble couples were often expected to consummate their marriage in front of witnesses. Sometimes it was symbolic, a few friends standing nearby pretending not to listen. Sometimes it was explicit, the bed curtains were opened and family members waited to see the stained sheets. And if there was no blood, if you didn't scream or flinch or show proper signs of maidenly distress, people started whispering. Were you pure? Had you been with someone else? Were you even a woman at all? That's where the pressure really tightens like a corset. Because even if you're terrified, even if it hurts, even if your husband's clumsy or cruel or just a sweaty, hairy stranger, you have to pretend it's okay. You have to perform pain, modesty, and eventually gratitude. If you're lucky, it's over quickly. If you're unlucky, it isn't. Either way, your virginity has been claimed and your usefulness has officially begun. And you might be thinking, was it really this bad for everyone? That's the part historians argue about. Some claim there was more private affection than we assume, small gestures, tender letters, secret smiles. But those stories mostly come from people who could write, which means they were rich, educated and literate. The average woman, her experiences weren't documented. We only see her through laws, punishments and the occasional mention in church court records when something went wrong. That's the haunting silence at the centre of all this. We don't really know how ordinary women felt about sex in Tudor England, but we know what happened to them, and what happened to them more often than not was confusion and shame. You weren't encouraged to ask questions. Curiosity could get you labelled immoral. If you laughed about sex, you were bold. If you tried to delay marriage, you were rebellious. If you showed desire, you were dangerous. So you went into marriage unprepared, unequipped and unsupported. A body given, not a person chosen. And the emotional cost? You didn't get therapy, you got prayers and sermons. You were told to submit to your husband, to honour God through obedience, and to find joy in motherhood, which, by the way, would start as soon as your body could handle it, or even before it could. There was no break, no adjustment period, no time to figure things out. Your body was a job site now. Even your female friends, if you had any close enough to whisper with, weren't likely to offer helpful advice. They were probably just as confused and scared as you were. Maybe one told you to close your eyes and think of your future children. Maybe another handed you a jar of herbs and said it would make things go easier. But there was no script, no roadmap, and certainly no understanding that sex could, or should, feel good for you. And here's the real tragedy. When something went wrong, if you bled too much, or your husband hurt you, or you couldn't get pregnant, you were blamed. Your body, your fault. You were punished by sense, isolation or suspicion. You couldn't talk about it. You couldn't ask for help. You just curled inward, clenched your teeth and carried on. So when people wax poetic about the romance of old-fashioned courtship, the corsets, the candlelight, the poetry, they're forgetting the rot beneath the lace. The truth is, Tudor sex was a minefield of ignorance, pain and control. For women especially, it was rarely about connection or affection, it was about survival. So if you're lying in bed now, safe and clean and warm, take a breath. You have access to information, to choice, to safety. That's more than most Tudor women ever had. But don't relax just yet. We've still got 27 more centuries of nonsense to trudge through. Up next, the terrifying world of virginity tests and the creepy obsession with proving your worth in blood. Sleep tight. So let's talk about the thing you've been dreading since your first awkward menstrual cycle. Virginity. In Tudor England, it's not just a concept, it's currency, reputation, value and destiny all wrapped up in one invisible thing you're expected to prove with blood on a sheet. Yeah, strap in. From the moment you hit puberty, which by Tudor standards might be around 11 or 12, your body isn't yours anymore. Not that it ever really was, but now, suddenly you're under surveillance. Everything you do, everything you wear, every time you smile too long at someone, It all reflects on your purity. That single slippery social label is more important than your intelligence, your kindness, or your ability to bake flawless trenchers. You're a walking dowry, and your value plummets the second someone suspects you've done anything more than hold hands. Virginity isn't just prized, it's obsessively guarded. Your parents are on edge. Your servants talk. If you're noble, your body is practically under curfew, and your reputation can collapse under a single rumour. One poorly timed look, one late-night walk in the gardens with a handsome stable boy, and boom, you're damaged goods. The worst part? There's no real way to prove you're innocent, and the methods they do use are absolute nightmares. Here's the big one, the blood-stained bedsheet. After your wedding night, it's expected that you'll bleed. Why? Because, supposedly, the hymen tears the first time you have penetrative sex, and the resulting blood proves you are untouched. Cue the mother-in-law or chambermaid marching in to collect the sheet, like some macabre relic. In some households, they even hang the sheet out the window or parade it around, as if to say, look, she was pure. It's gross. It's medieval. And yes, it actually happened. But biology doesn't always play along. Some women don't bleed during their first time. Some hymens stretch or break earlier, while riding horses, climbing trees, or doing any number of perfectly innocent things. Others bleed a lot, and still others are so tense and terrified that nothing even happens, which then leads to rumours that you're broken, or even not a woman. That's how unforgiving the culture is. If your body doesn't fit the myth, you're in trouble. Here's a genuine historical fact. In many noble marriages, especially politically arranged ones, the consummation wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a legal requirement. If a marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. That meant the bride had to perform her purity convincingly enough to count, and the groom had to report success, ideally with evidence. The bedchamber often became a courtroom, and you were the unconsenting defendant, and if the blood didn't show up, that's where the nightmare really starts. People might whisper that you weren't a virgin. You could be interrogated. Your husband might accuse you of deceit. In some cases, young brides were subjected to humiliating virginity tests, physical examinations by midwives or even priests to determine whether your body was intact. It was invasive, degrading, and medically speaking, absolutely meaningless. But that didn't matter. What mattered was what people believed. Here's the fringe fact. In a few recorded cases, families faked the blood. Yep, they'd smear chicken blood or pig's blood on the sheets just to make sure the right evidence was there in the morning. That's how high the stakes were. Your entire family's honour could hinge on whether you stained a sheet at 16 years old, and if you didn't, you might be sent home in disgrace. Or worse, accused of seduction, witchcraft, or even adultery. Let's not pretend the men were under the same pressure. Boys were often encouraged to practice before marriage. In fact, noble boys might be sent to brothels to gain experience, often as young as 13 or 14, but you're supposed to arrive at the altar untouched, unkissed, and completely ignorant, and then somehow perform well enough in bed, in front of witnesses, to secure your place in society. If you're starting to feel a slow burn of rage under your skin, you're not alone. This double standard was brutal. Women were told to be modest and meek, to avoid temptation, to fear desire, but men were given the opposite message, that women were temptresses, and it was their job to resist. So if a man fell into sin, it was often blamed on the woman. She seduced him, she lured him, even if she had no power, no intention, and no voice. And here's where it gets worse. If you were sexually assaulted, it was nearly impossible to prove. The concept of consent barely existed in law or custom. If you couldn't scream loud enough, fight hard enough, or prove you had resisted, people might decide you actually wanted it. That's how twisted the logic was. Your silence could damn you. Your pain could be ignored. And your future, your marriage prospects, your status, your safety could vanish overnight. There's a bitter scholarly debate over how widespread these virginity rituals were. Some historians argue the blood-stained sheet was more symbolic than common. Others point to court records, church documentations, and personal letters that suggest it was taken very seriously in some regions and social classes. But what's clear is this. The pressure was real and the fear was constant. Even among peasants, where marriages were less politically loaded, a woman's reputation could still mean life or death. A girl rumoured to be easy might be abandoned by a suitor. She might be mocked, beaten, or thrown out of her family's home. And if she got pregnant outside of wedlock, that opened up a whole new hellscape one will get to soon. For now, you lie awake in that rope bed, sore, humiliated, and exhausted. The blood on the sheet is being carried out like a trophy, and all you can think is, this is what it means to be a wife? To be pure? To have your body's most intimate moment turned into a public performance? Yeah. In Tudor England, virginity wasn't a phase, it was a test, and you didn't get to decide the rules. But hey, things can only go up from here, right? Unless, of course, you're about to be sold off in marriage at 12. Oh wait, that's next. Let's say you survive the virginity trial, the bedsheet parade, and the general trauma of your wedding night. You're married now. Congratulations, or condolences. But don't get too comfortable. You've probably been married off before you even finished growing, because in Tudor England, especially if you're a woman, you don't get a childhood so much as a countdown. The moment you show signs of puberty, someone starts planning where to ship you, who to sell you to, and how many babies your pelvis can produce before it gives out. If you're born into a noble family, marriage isn't about love. It's about land, money, and alliances. Think of yourself as a bargaining chip in a centuries-long game of Monopoly. Accept the stakes are your freedom, your body, and your ability to survive childbirth. Your parents likely arranged your marriage years ago, when you were still playing with carved dolls and trying to figure out how to spell your own name. The boy you're promised to might be your cousin, a family rival, or some greasy, red-faced lord who's already buried 2 wives. Romantic, right? A real historical fact, noble girls could be officially married by age 12. That was the legal age of consent under English common law. Often, the marriage was formalised young, and then the couple lived apart until the girl was considered physically ready to consummate the marriage, usually around 14. But ready is a generous word. Most of these girls were terrified, unprepared, and still waiting for their hips to widen and their breasts to fully develop. If you're imagining white dresses and church bells, erase that. Think more like political transaction at the manor house, witnessed by half-drunk nobles, with a priest muttering Latin no one understands. For common girls, it wasn't much better. You didn't get arranged marriage deals between powerful families, but your options were limited to the local pool, the blacksmith's son, the brewer's apprentice, or someone your father owed a favour to. Courtship didn't mean days or flowers. It meant being watched like a hawk by your parents, your neighbours, and the village gossip chain. Flirt too much and you're a harlot. Say no too often and you're a shrew. Again, no winning. The actual courting process, such as it was, often involved creepy poetry. Men, especially the literate ones, loved writing sonnets to their prospective wives. These poems usually compared women to roses, angels, or, bizarrely, pieces of fruit. Ripe fruit, of course, unplucked, ready to be tasted. If you think that sounds weird and slightly threatening, you're not wrong. Women were rarely allowed to write back with the same honesty. Your reply might be a polite smile or a stitched handkerchief. If you were lucky, you liked the man. If you weren't, well, too bad. Here's your fringe fact. People in the Tudor era actually believed that seeing someone's portrait could be enough to fall in love. In noble circles, arranged marriages often began with an exchange of paintings, painstakingly rendered, slightly idealised depictions of the bride and groom. But these portraits were often outdated or embellished. So you might agree to marry someone based on a picture painted 5 years ago, only to meet them and find out they've aged like milk. By then it's too late. The contract is signed. You're stuck. And here's where things get really awkward. Your body might not even be fully developed yet, but your womb is considered open for business. The minute your period starts, you're assumed fertile, and the expectation to conceive kicks in. Remember, the whole point of your marriage isn't companionship, it's procreation. That means sex, as often as possible, no matter how much it hurts or how much you want to scream and crawl into the fireplace. You don't get a honeymoon. If you're noble, you might be sent off to your husband's estate, packed into a rickety carriage with a dowry chest full of linens, silver spoons, and enough herbal remedies to survive the first few weeks. If you're a peasant girl, you might move into a one-room cottage, sharing space with livestock and in-laws. Either way, you're no longer a girl, you're a wife, a property, a broodmare. Scholars argue about how much affection actually developed between married couples. Some point to surviving letters and diaries that suggest real love did emerge over time. Others say those examples are rare and often limited to elite families who had the luxury of writing things down. For most people, love wasn't part of the equation. It might come later, like mould on cheese, but more often it didn't come at all. Here's the thing. Even if you got lucky and married someone close to your age, someone who didn't reek of liver pie and misogyny, the system was still against you. Legally, your husband owned everything. Your money, your land, your clothes, your body. You couldn't say no to sex, you couldn't leave without cause, you couldn't vote, inherit in most cases, or testify against your husband in court. You weren't a partner, you were a subordinate of yours. And this wasn't just a formality, it was enforced. If you disobeyed or failed to fulfill your wifely duties, you could be beaten. Gently, of course. The law said husbands were allowed to discipline their wives with a rod no thicker than a man's thumb. Hence the delightful origin of the phrase rule of thumb. Cosy, isn't it? If you tried to escape a marriage, ran away, refused to sleep with your husband, or, heaven forbid, cheated, you risked public shaming, imprisonment, or worse. Adultery for women was considered not just immoral, but treasonous. Men might get a slap on the wrist or a knowing smirk, but women, you could be branded, humiliated, even executed, especially if you were married to someone important. And we haven't even gotten to Henry VIII yet. But oh, we will. So here you are, 14 years old, waking up in a strange bed next to a man you barely know. Your body is sore, your stomach is already queasy from the herbal fertility tea you were forced to drink, and your mother-in-law keeps whispering about how she hopes it's a boy. You want to go home, but you don't have a home anymore. You are the home now, or you're supposed to be. The weight of all of this, the expectations, the fear, the sudden violence of growing up is heavy, crushing even, and you're supposed to carry it with grace, with silence, with a smile. The truth is, your childhood didn't end with marriage. It just got rebranded as motherhood. And if you think that's going to be an upgrade, oh, my sweet summer child. So here you are, married, maybe still 14, probably already exhausted. And guess what? You're pregnant. Or if you're not yet, your husband is starting to get impatient. Everyone's watching your belly like it's a loaf of bread that's taking too long to rise. The midwife gives you a look every time she visits, and your mother-in-law keeps bringing you boiled root vegetables and muttering about fertility. Because in Tudor England, a woman's worth isn't just measured by whether she bleeds on her wedding night. It's measured by how quickly she can start popping out babies. But let's back up a bit, because it's not like anyone gave you a manual on how this works. You've barely figured out what sex even is, and now your entire body's about to become a battleground. Pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, it all just hits you like a wall of bricks. You go from being a child to being a vessel overnight, and no one asks if you're ready. Of course you're not. Your first sign might be missed periods, assuming you're tracking them, which by the way, no one teaches you to do. More likely you realise something's different because your appetite changes, or you start feeling like you're going to vomit every morning. That's right, morning sickness. A charming Tudor term for it? The rising of the womb. Because again, they thought your uterus moved around your body like a balloon. That's the level of medical understanding we're dealing with. Here's a genuine historical fact. Tudor medical theory was dominated by the idea of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. All disease, including pregnancy complications, was believed to stem from an imbalance of these fluids. So if you were ill while pregnant, you might be prescribed bleeding, purging or cooling foods like lettuce and cucumber. None of this helped, obviously, but they believed it, so that's what you got. And then there's the issue of consent, again. Once you're married, your husband has the legal right to sex whenever he wants it. You could be sick, sore, mid-cycle, just had a baby, doesn't matter. Fusing your husband, that could be considered defiance. Some men took it personally, accusing their wives of being witches, adulterers or ungrateful. You're expected to be ever available, ever receptive, ever obedient. Your body isn't yours anymore. It's a tool, a resource. The first pregnancy is the scariest. You have no idea what to expect. You might start to swell. Your breasts ache. Your feet hurt. There's no ultrasound, no prenatal vitamins, no gentle midwife explaining what's normal. What you have is guesswork and superstition. If you crave salty foods, it might mean you're having a boy. If you have heartburn, your child will be hairy. If you dream of water, it's a bad omen. Everyone has an opinion. No one has real answers. And here's a fringe fact that feels almost too weird to be true. Some people believed that your baby's personality could be shaped by what you saw or thought during pregnancy. If you saw something sinful, your baby could be born with a mark. If you were scared during a thunderstorm, the child might be nervous for life. It was called maternal impression, and it led to a lot of women being blamed for how their babies turned out. especially if the child was disabled, quiet or difficult. And what if you didn't get pregnant quickly? Well, that was your fault too. Never mind that your husband might be firing blanks or suffering from any number of conditions no one could diagnose. If you didn't conceive within a year or two, people started whispering. Your in-laws suggested herbal teas. The midwife might rub goose fat on your belly. The priest might advise you to pray harder. Some women were even accused of using witchcraft to prevent pregnancy, because obviously that's the most reasonable explanation. There's a heavy scholarly debate about how infertility was viewed. While the church preached that barrenness was a test of faith, the everyday reality was more brutal. A woman who couldn't have children was often seen as broken. In some cases, men used infertility as grounds for annulment, leaving their wives disgraced and destitute. And in the worst cases, women were publicly shamed, even perhaps beaten, for failing to fulfill their role, because that's what being a woman was reduced to, a womb with legs. And if you did manage to get pregnant, now you're facing a whole new set of horrors. There's no prenatal care, no sterile environment, no trained doctors for the poor, only midwives, herbalists and well-meaning neighbours. You're told not to lift heavy objects. You're warned against walking in moonlight. You're fed strange broths and encouraged to talk to the baby through your belly, as if it's listening. There are no guarantees. Every pregnancy is a gamble, and you still have to work. There's no maternity leave when your daily life is spent hauling water, kneading dough and tending livestock. Even noble women are expected to entertain guests, manage the household and maintain appearances. If you're lucky, you get to lie in, a period of seclusion during the final weeks of pregnancy. But that's only if your family can afford to let you rest. Otherwise, you labour until labour. And here's the terrifying part. Childbirth is one of the leading causes of death for women. It's not rare. It's expected. You've seen your mother give birth. Maybe you watched your sister die from it. You know the sounds, the screams, the silence that follows when it goes wrong. You know what happens when the baby gets stuck, when the bleeding won't stop, when the midwife can't fix it. And yet, no one prepares you. You lie down on a straw-covered bed surrounded by women. Maybe your mother, the midwife, a neighbour who's had 9 children and no teeth. They chant prayers, they burn herbs, they boil water, though not for hygiene, just tradition. Your husband waits outside, probably drinking. He won't see you, not unless something goes terribly wrong. You push, you scream, you beg, you tear. If the baby lives, you're congratulated. If it's a boy, your status goes up. If it's a girl, well, try again next year, and the year after that, until your body gives out. You're 14, maybe 15. You've already given up your childhood, your body, and your autonomy. And now you're a mother, again and again and again. No one asks if you're tired. No one cares if it hurts. That's your job. That's what you're here for. So when people today say, wouldn't it be nice to go back to simpler times? No, it wouldn't. Now that you've been married off at an age when modern kids are still learning algebra and managed to survive your first childbirth, which, statistically speaking, you might not, let's dive into one of the ugliest truths of Tudor sex. Consent wasn't just ignored, it didn't even exist as a concept. You know that little idea that your body is your own? That you get to decide who touches you and when and how? Yeah, not a thing, not legally, not socially, not even whispered about over embroidery hoops. In the world you live in now, your body belongs to your husband, full stop. The marriage contract says so. Once those vows are said and the sheets are bloodied, or faked, depending on your creativity, you're officially a wife, and that means your husband has full sexual rights over you. Whether you're ready, whether you're willing, whether you're in the mood, sick, grieving, or physically recovering from your last pregnancy, it doesn't matter. You're expected to say yes by default. And not saying anything at all still counts as consent. Silence is permission. That's the law and that's the norm. In fact, here's a concrete historical fact. Under English common law, there was no such thing as marital rape until the 1990s, not the 1690s. The 90s. The legal idea that a husband could be guilty of raping his wife simply didn't exist for centuries because marriage was considered an unbreakable contract of sexual access. And in Tudor England, that idea was even more aggressively enforced. Marriage gave men ownership of land, of inheritance, of labour, and yes, of their wives' bodies. And if your husband wasn't particularly gentle, or if he had a temper, you had nowhere to go. There were no shelters, no police who would listen, no divorce courts ready to weigh your feelings. Divorce was almost impossible. The church would grant annulments under very specific rare conditions, impotence, consanguinity, extreme cruelty. But he rapes me regularly and I'm afraid for my life wasn't on the list. Your priest might tell you to pray harder. Your neighbours might gossip. Your own parents might advise you to submit. After all, he's your husband. Here's a fringe historical tidbit that makes this even grimmer. Some church officials wrote guides instructing women on how to endure sex they didn't want. Not refuse, not avoid, just endure. The advice usually included things like, don't look him in the eyes, imagine something pleasant, and remember your duty to God. You were told to view it as a kind of holy suffering, a sacrifice for the greater good. Your pain was piety, your silence was grace. And what if you resisted? What if you refused to perform your wifely duties? Well, there were consequences. A man could beat his wife for disobedience, within limits. The law allowed moderate correction, which was left conveniently vague. If your bruises were too obvious, people might murmur disapproval, but no one would stop him. No one would arrest him. Your suffering was domestic business. Private. Acceptable. There's an ongoing scholarly debate over just how common domestic abuse was in the Tudor period. Some argue that legal records show women did bring complaints to local courts, church courts especially, but the punishments were usually light and temporary. A small fine, a warning, maybe some public penance. Others say that the complaints were just the tip of the iceberg, and that most abuse went unreported, hidden behind thick cottage walls or ignored in the back rooms of grand estates. But even if physical violence wasn't always present, the psychological weight of non-consensual sex was constant. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that your husband has the right to use your body whenever he wishes. No questions, no foreplay, no negotiation. Your desires, irrelevant. Your pain, a mild inconvenience. If you cry, he might be annoyed. If you complain, he might be suspicious. If you retaliate, he might accuse you of being unfaithful or defiant or worse, possessed. And don't even think about saying no if you're pregnant, or postpartum, or bleeding, especially if the heir hasn't been produced yet. Your husband wants a son, and he'll keep trying until he gets one. You are, in effect, a walking womb, a factory with a heartbeat. If you miscarry, he blames your body. If the baby's a girl, he blames your womb. If you can't get pregnant again right away, he blames your soul. Here's another chilling fact. In some households, sex wasn't just coerced, it was scheduled. Wealthy noblemen kept conjugal logs, recording when they had intercourse with their wives to track fertility. It was treated like bookkeeping, not affection, not intimacy, just logistics. And if you weren't producing results, your name in the log might be followed by a question mark, or a frown, or worse, silence. For the poorest women, things were even bleaker. Husbands were often drunk, overworked, or violent. Marriage didn't come with protection, it came with risk. One bad harvest, one failed crop, one lost job, and tensions boiled over. You were the easiest target. No education, no escape, no choice. Your body was a battleground and a bargaining chip, and you never even got to draw the map. And what about desire? What about pleasure? Those were dangerous words. A woman who enjoyed sex too much was labelled unnatural, immoral, possibly demonic. The church warned against carnal lust, especially in women. Passion was sin. Moaning was suspicion, wanting it was wickedness. You were supposed to be passive, grateful, obedient. To enjoy sex too much was to risk your soul and maybe your life. You might think, maybe someone, anyone, would have spoken up. A philosopher, a theologian, a midwife, a friend. But no, the few women who dared speak about bodily autonomy were either ignored or punished. If you advocated for yourself too loudly, you were labelled a heretic. If you refused your husband outright, he might take you to court for disobedience, or he might just beat you until you stopped saying no, or he'd stop bothering with you altogether and find a mistress, which brought its own set of humiliations. So no, consent didn't exist. Not in law, not in custom, not in your bedroom. You didn't get a safe word, you didn't get to say, not tonight, I have a headache. You were a wife. That was your job title, your identity, your curse. And tomorrow you'll wake up sore, exhausted, maybe pregnant again, and the cycle will start all over. The fire needs stoking, the stew needs stirring, and your husband's waiting. If you thought your bedroom was bad, just wait until the church gets involved. Because if Tudor marriage turns your body into someone else's property, the church turns your soul into a battlefield. And when it comes to sex, the church isn't just a quiet presence in the background. It's front and centre, wagging a bony finger at every thrust, moan or flicker of desire. And especially if you're a woman, your pleasure is considered not just irrelevant, but dangerous. Sex, according to the teachings of the time, was for one purpose and one purpose only: procreation. You could enjoy your bread, your cider, your stained glass windows, but if you enjoyed sex, that was the devil knocking. If you felt desire, that was your sinful nature revealing itself. And if you acted on it outside of marriage, or, heaven forbid, enjoyed it even within marriage, you were practically wearing horns already. Confession time wasn't just about stolen apples or skipped prayers. No, people confessed carnal sins in vivid, excruciating detail. Did you touch yourself? Sin. Did you enjoy your husband's touch too much? Sin. Did you think about someone else while you were with him? Double sin. And women were the ones who bore the brunt of these expectations. Men might be weak, but women were temptresses, the daughters of Eve. You were the one who offered the apple. And now every twinge of desire in your body is a reminder that you're flawed, fallen, and one bad thought away from hellfire. Here's an actual historical fact. The church taught that sex was inherently tainted by original sin, and the only holy kind of intercourse was the kind that happened within marriage, strictly for the purpose of conceiving children. So even married couples were urged to restrain themselves. Missionary position only, lights out, not that you had lights, and no lingering afterward. Anything else, oral sex, different positions, touching each other too much, was considered unnatural. Lust, even between spouses, was to be resisted. And if your husband wanted more, that was your problem. If he wanted you at all hours, in all conditions, you were told to obey, and confess later. There was no real framework for mutual consent or emotional intimacy. The church didn't ask, do you feel safe? Do you feel pleasure? Do you feel seen? It asked, are you pure? Are you subsistent? Are you ashamed? The highest ideal for a woman wasn't a loving wife. It was the Virgin Mary, docile, untouched, holy. Try to competing with that. Here's your fringe detail for the night. There were actual sex calendars, printed and distributed in some regions, laying out which days you could and couldn't have intercourse based on holy days, saints' days, fasts, and feast days. Spoiler alert, there weren't many green lights. Between Lent, Advent, Fridays, Sundays, feast days, and over 100 religious observances, sex was off limits for half the year. So if you were trying to conceive, you had to fit it into a tight, guilt-ridden schedule, with confession hanging over your head like a sword. And if you violated those rules, you risked not just eternal damnation, but social punishment too. You might be brought before a church court, shamed publicly, forced to do penance. Sometimes that meant standing barefoot outside the church, wearing a sackcloth and reciting your sins. Other times it meant being denied communion or even excommunicated. For women whose reputations were already paper thin, this could destroy everything. One accusation of unchastity, be it, and your name could become a curse whispered in the market for the rest of your life. Scholars still argue about how strictly these rules were enforced. Some believe church courts were more lenient than we give them credit for, focusing on genuine abuses rather than every small transgression. Others point to the mountains of surviving court records, packed with cases of sexual misconduct, especially involving women. Unwed pregnancies, adultery, fornication, even flirtation. If someone tattled, and someone usually did, you could find yourself kneeling in front of a priest and a judgmental crowd, explaining why your husband found you too enthusiastic last night. And don't think you're safe just because you keep your mouth shut. The church didn't need evidence. It needed rumour, suspicion, a neighbour's complaint, a jealous wife's whisper, a priest with a grudge, and once your name was in the records, good luck shaking it. You could be shamed for years. Even if you did everything right, the mere perception of being unchaste could ruin your chances of marriage, inheritance, or social standing. But here's the most insidious part. Even as the church preached sexual restraint and condemned female desire, it still relied on women's reproduction to sustain the population, the economy, and, yes, the church itself. You were told to avoid sin, but also to have children, to be modest but also fertile, to serve your husband but not tempt him. You had to walk the razor-thin line between holy and harlot, and if you slipped, you fell hard. Some of the more extreme preachers warned that hell was filled with women who enjoyed sex, not murderers, not thieves, just women who moaned too loudly, who lingered too long, who let their minds wander. The sermons were thick with warnings about Jezebels, Delilahs, witches and widows who smiled too much. You might sit in the pew, pregnant with your third child, and still feel the heat of shame crawling up your spine because your husband kissed your neck the night before and you liked it. So what do you do with that guilt? You bury it. You mumble prayers, you light candles, you perform. You repent for sins you never meant to commit, for feelings you never asked to have, for instincts that make you feel more like a woman and less like a saint, and it changes you. You become quieter. You keep your thoughts locked up tight. You learn to flinch less. You learn to fake sleep when he enters the room. You think about God not because you feel spiritual, but because you hope he's watching. You hope he knows this isn't what you wanted, that you're trying to be good, that you're not wicked, just human. Because in Tudor England, being a woman who wants more pleasure, more understanding, more control, isn't brave, it's dangerous. And speaking of danger, let's look a little closer at the place where all this goes down. Your bed. Or rather, the sagging, splintery, bug-riddled platform they call a bed. Next stop, straw mattresses, squeaky ropes, and the fine art of trying not to scream while your in-laws sleep 10 feet away. Let's set the scene. It's late. The fire has burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows across the walls. You're lying in bed, if we're generous enough to call it that. A wooden frame lashed together with thick hemp ropes strung into a loose web that sags in the middle like a dying hammock. On top is a mattress stuffed with straw, feathers if you're rich, but mostly just the same scratchy clumps you used to feed the pigs. Every movement sends up a soft, itchy crunch, and every shift pulls the ropes tighter until they creak like a ship caught in a storm. This is where the magic happens, if it happens. And no, you're not alone in the house. There's no such thing as privacy, not unless you're royalty. You might share this room with your children, your siblings, maybe a cousin or a servant who pretends to sleep while very much not sleeping. Thin linen curtains might offer a bit of separation, but they don't block out sound or smell. So if you're trying to have a moment with your husband, you've got to do it knowing your mother-in-law is snoring 4 feet away and a chicken is roosting somewhere in the corner. The Tudor bedchamber isn't a romantic escape. It's a practical, overcrowded, pungent box that traps body heat, noise, and every cough of the season. Windows, if they exist, are tiny and barely let in light, much less fresh air. Chimneys are temperamental and belch smoke into the room when the wind changes direction. And let's not even talk about the fleas. Actually no, let's absolutely talk about the fleas, because they're going to be your nightly companions for years. Here's your historical fact. Tudor homes didn't have modern insulation or sealed floors. The gaps between wooden beams in the walls were packed with wattle and daub, basically a mix of mud, straw and animal hair. Perfect nesting grounds for bugs. Lice, fleas and bed bugs thrived in this environment. Mattresses were rarely cleaned, linens were washed infrequently, and bathing, as we've covered, was practically a seasonal event. You were basically sleeping inside a living ecosystem of filth, sharing your body heat with parasites. That's the baseline. Now throw sex on top of it. Think about trying to feel intimate or even slightly interested while you're lying flat on a pokey surface, being bitten by unseen creatures, surrounded by your relatives, with the smell of smoke, boiled turnips and unwashed bodies clinging to every inch of air. Your husband climbs into bed beside you, or depending on your rank, is led in by servants who then leave awkwardly after dimming a rushlight. He smells like sweat and ale and horses. His breath is a challenge. Your nightdress is scratchy. You have to keep your knees covered until the last possible second, or risk being called immodest, and still somehow the act must be completed. Here's a fringe fact for you. In some noble households, couples had their marital beds blessed by a priest. It was supposed to sanctify the union, purify the marriage, and turn what was about to happen into a holy duty rather than just two people fumbling around in the dark. This same bed might be used again and again for multiple heirs, and if the marriage failed to produce children, the bed sometimes got blamed. No joke, there are records of couples buying new beds in hopes that it would improve fertility, as if the creaking furniture were the one slacking off. But even if the bed cooperates, there's still the matter of technique, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Most Tudor couples had little to no sexual education, and certainly nothing about pleasure, anatomy or foreplay. If you're a woman, your first sexual experiences are probably confusing at best and painful at worst. If your husband is young and awkward, it might be over in seconds. If he's older and aggressive, it might leave bruises. Either way, you're expected to say nothing. Just lie back, clench your jaw, and let it happen. The act is supposed to be silent, efficient, and goal-oriented. No moaning, no experimenting. Just enough movement to get a baby going, and then everyone rolls over and pretends it didn't happen. And again, let's not forget, there's an entire household within earshot. Servants, siblings, possibly your own children are right there. The walls are thin, the floorboards creak. There's no music to drown anything out. If you make a sound, someone will hear, and then they'll talk. Gossip was currency, and sex, especially loud or unusual sex, was fuel for weeks of whispers. Even moaning in the night could be taken as a sign of excessive lust, which for a woman was about as welcome as syphilis. Which brings us to the scholarly debate. Was all sex in Tudor beds really this bleak? Some argue that among the lower classes, where privacy was non-existent and daily life was full of shared labour, couples had to develop a sense of humour and intimacy just to get by. Maybe they laughed about the chickens, maybe they whispered under the blankets, maybe they figured out ways to steal moments of affection between chores and candlelit dinners of cold stew, but others point to the overwhelming social pressure, religious fear, and physical discomfort and say, no, it was just as grim as it sounds. And even if there was affection, it often got swallowed by the sheer logistics of survival. You're exhausted, you're bleeding, you're pregnant again, your back hurts, your baby is teething. You just pulled a chamber pot out from under the bed and emptied it into a stinking cesspit. The idea of intimacy becomes a distant luxury, something for poets and play actors, not for real women living in cold rooms with wet feet and someone else's lice crawling up their nightdress. Every night is a repeat performance. Tighten the ropes on the bed, shake out the straw, lie down, say a quick prayer, and brace yourself for the creak of floorboards. Your body isn't a place of joy, it's a tool, a duty, and your bed isn't a place of comfort. It's a job site. And no, you don't get paid, just bruises, stretch marks, and another mouth to feed. But hey, at least you've got candlelight, right? Oh wait, those are expensive. Hope you like doing it in the dark. Here's a little question no one in Tudor England seems to ask you. Did you finish? Did you enjoy it? Did the clouds part, the angels sing, the earth move? Of course not, because none of that matters. In Tudor sex, especially for women, pleasure isn't just overlooked, it's practically outlawed. As far as the men are concerned, if he finishes, mission accomplished. Anything beyond that, unnecessary, unimportant, even suspicious. You might as well be asking for a pet dragon. Let's say the act is over. Your husband collapses beside you, already snoring. Maybe he grunts something vaguely appreciative. Maybe not. You're lying there in the dark, sore, confused, and completely unfulfilled. There's no cuddling, no sweet talk. You're probably already wondering if you're pregnant. No one's asking how you feel because in this world, women's pleasure isn't even part of the sexual equation. It's like trying to do math with numbers that don't exist. Here's a grim little historical fact. Tudor medical texts focused almost entirely on the male orgasm. That was the big finale. That was the point. If he ejaculated, everything had gone according to plan. Whether you participated or not was irrelevant. In fact, many men, and more than a few doctors, believed women didn't even need to orgasm. Some thought it happened, sure, but didn't see the point. Others actively discouraged it, warning that too much pleasure could make a woman sick, sinful, or difficult to control. You enjoying sex was treated like a malfunction, not a feature. And yet, paradoxically, some scholars in the period did believe female orgasm was necessary for conception. Not for your benefit, mind you, but for baby-making efficiency. The thinking went like this. Men release seed, women release some sort of matching fluid, and when both happen, conception follows. So in this weird corner of medieval science, your climax was helpful, even required, but still not discussed. You were expected to achieve its sightness instantly, and without needing anything more than missionary position and a prayer. If you didn't orgasm, too bad. If you did and showed it, risky. A woman who enjoyed sex too visibly, too audibly, too frequently might draw suspicion. Was she naturally lustful? Was she cheating? Was she practicing some kind of witchcraft to inflame desire? There are actual records of women being accused of unnatural passion simply because they expressed physical joy. In Tudor logic, pleasure for women equals danger. The less you wanted it, the holier you were. Here's your fringe fact of the night. Some midwives believed a woman's orgasm could be triggered by the breath of the male lover. Specifically, his breath entering her mouth during kissing could warm her womb and excite her seed. So there's your hot tip for Tudor foreplay. Kiss her deeply and hope your breath isn't rank from pickled onions and tooth decay. Again, this wasn't about her pleasure, really. It was about optimizing conception. Everything was always about making more babies. But what if you wanted more? What if you dared to ask for it? What if you whispered in the dark, "Can you touch me there again?" Well, that would have gone over like a bucket of cold water at a feast. You'd be called immodest, or brazen, or worse, too much like a man. Women weren't supposed to desire. You were supposed to endure. The only acceptable expression of female sexuality was silent gratitude. Anything else could make you suspect. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how common female pleasure really was in Tudor marriage beds. Some letters, diaries and bawdy poetry suggest that at least a few couples found ways to enjoy each other. But those are exceptions. Most women didn't read or write, and the men who did weren't exactly rushing to document their wives' satisfaction. If anything, the most honest accounts of female desire come from court records, where women were being punished for pursuing it. Take this scenario. A woman has an affair, maybe with someone who actually listens to her. She's caught, of course, because it's Tudor England and someone's always watching. She's dragged before a local court, accused not just of adultery, but of being unnaturally lustful. Her crime isn't just cheating, it's wanting. The language used against her is vicious. She's described as wild, wicked, animalistic. No one asks what drove her to it. No one cares if her husband was cruel or absent, or simply a brick of wood with bad breath. She wanted more than her lot, and that alone is unforgivable. Now imagine the reverse. A man cheats. Maybe he visits brothels, maybe he keeps a mistress tucked away in a nearby village. Does anyone care? Barely. His wife might complain to the priest, the neighbours might gossip a little, but he's not dragged through the streets or denied communion. He's a man. Men have needs. You, however, are expected to sit quietly with your embroidery while he gets it out of his system. There's no equality here, no mutual exploration, no slow, breathy build-up to mutual satisfaction. Just obligation, performance, exhaustion. It's like living in a play where you're never allowed to be the lead, only the set piece that makes the hero's story possible. And even in moments when things could feel good, accidentally, momentarily, you're trained to ignore it, to feel guilty, to push it down. You might lie in bed afterward, heart racing, wondering if that flutter in your stomach was sin or something worse. You don't talk about it with your friends, you don't ask questions, you don't keep a diary, because if anyone found it, you'd be ruined. So you lock it away, you train your body to be quiet, you flinch less, you stop expecting anything at all, and before long you forget what it was like to even want pleasure. That part of you fades into the fog of duty and motherhood and aching bones. Maybe it resurfaces once in a while, in a dream, in a brief touch, in the way your skin reacts to sunlight through a window. But it never lasts, not in this world. Because here, sex isn't about you, it never was. And speaking of women's bodies being labelled dangerous, next, let's explore how your perfectly natural responses could land you in the stocks, or at the stake. That's right. Time to meet the medical menace known as hysteria, and the delightful fantasy of your womb wandering off on its own like some haunted meat balloon. So you're exhausted, underfed, sore from yet another joyless night on a mattress full of straw and regret, and now something inside you feels off. Maybe your heart races for no reason, maybe you feel faint when nothing's wrong, or your emotions swing wildly from weeping to furious with no clear cause. You're anxious, agitated, maybe you even start shaking or hyperventilating. In the 21st century, someone might say you're having a panic attack or maybe a hormonal imbalance. But here in Tudor England, you, my dear, are suffering from hysteria. And it's all because your womb is on the move. No, really. One of the leading medical theories of the time, carried over from ancient Greek physicians and still widely believed in Tudor England, was that a woman's womb wasn't fixed in place. It was seen as a wandering, mischievous little creature, like a rogue balloon animal with attitude. If you were celibate for too long, or too sexually active, or emotionally distressed, or just a woman in general, your womb might get bored and start drifting around your body. It might rise up and choke your throat, press against your heart, cause fevers, convulsions, irrational behaviour. Welcome to the myth of the wandering womb, because clearly your uterus is both a reproductive organ and a troublemaking spirit with poor navigation skills. Here's a historical fact that will make you roll your eyes so hard they might sprain. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. Physicians believed that many female ailments, emotional, physical, mental, were rooted in disturbances of the uterus. So if you were crying too much, fainting at church, or having what we now understand as seizures, the diagnosis was probably some variation of your womb is acting up. So how did they treat this alleged womb rebellion? Oh, buckle up. One method was to apply strong-smelling substances near the vagina to lure the womb back into place, like it was a confused animal who just needed to be coaxed home with lavender oil. At the same time, other pungent herbs might be waved under the nose to repel it from the upper body. Yes, really. It was like exorcising a poltergeist, but the ghost is your uterus and everyone's taking this very seriously. Another treatment? Marriage. Obviously, if a young woman showed signs of hysteria, nervousness, melancholy, headaches, fatigue, the standard prescription was to get her married off as soon as possible. Regular bioreactor intercourse, they believed, would keep the womb settled and content. Forget rest or emotional support. What you need is a husband and a steady regimen of exhausting, likely non-consensual sex. You can practically hear the womb sigh in relief. Now, here's your fringe fact. Some more advanced physicians believed female pleasure was essential to calming the womb, but instead of letting women explore that on their own terms, guess what they did? They assisted. Some male doctors actually took it upon themselves to manually stimulate their patients to orgasm, medically of course, calling it a therapeutic technique to relieve hysteria. Let that sink in. A man in a wig and robes claiming it's for your health, giving you a completely unsolicited treatment with his bare hands. If it sounds like abuse wrapped in a lab coat, that's because it was. And if you were poor or unlucky enough to land in a hospital, or what passed for one, you might be dosed with strange concoctions, boiled herbs, vinegars, animal parts. One particularly lovely remedy involved ground-up deer antler mixed with wine. Not that it worked, but it was thought to calm your womb's wanderlust. You might also be bled. Of course, because why wouldn't pouring your blood into a bowl help with your uterus being in your throat? Here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Was hysteria a genuine diagnosis, or just a convenient label for everything Tudor society didn't understand or want to deal with? Modern historians tend to agree it was a catch-all term. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, hormonal shifts, epilepsy, even simple rebellion could all be swept under the hysteria rug. It was the go-to explanation when a woman wasn't behaving properly. If you were too quiet, you were hysterical. Too loud, hysterical. If you cried during childbirth or screamed during sex, or stared too long at the moon, the womb was to blame. And it wasn't just young women. Older women, especially widows and spinsters, were viewed as ticking time bombs of unspent sexual energy. Their dried up, unused wombs were seen as especially dangerous. That's right, not having sex anymore wasn't a sign of peace or wisdom. It was cause for concern. Without a man's regular influence, your womb might go rogue. You could become bitter, sarcastic, moody, witchy. In fact, the leap from hysterical to witch was terrifyingly short. A woman who exhibited too many unexplained symptoms, seizures, fits, emotional outbursts, might go from being considered sick to being accused of sorcery. You start with a tincture and end with a torch. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly Tudor medicine blended into superstition, and how fragile your safety was if your body didn't behave exactly as expected. And remember, all of this is happening in a society where you have almost no say over your health. You can't read medical texts. They're written in Latin and meant for men. You can't choose your doctor. He's assigned or comes with your husband's approval. If you disagree with your diagnosis, or worse, refuse treatment, you could be punished for insubordination, a dangerous woman, a liar, maybe even possessed. So you learn to nod, to accept, to pretend that the smoke-blown herbs and boiled deer hooves are helping. You swallow your fear, you hide your symptoms, you practice being docile because a quiet woman is a safe woman, and a safe woman doesn't get tied to a stake. And that's what makes this whole wandering womb nonsense so cruel. It pathologizes your body's perfectly normal responses, grief, anger, exhaustion, and turns them into evidence that something's wrong with you, that you need fixing, that you're being. It erases your humanity and replaces it with myth. So the next time your chest tightens or your mood swings, remember, it's not that you're overwhelmed. It's just your womb making a break for it. And speaking of things you can't talk about without getting blamed, what happens when you can't get pregnant? Or worse, when your pregnancy ends in miscarriage? Yep, that's your fault too. You've been married for a year, maybe 2. You've done everything right, or at least you've tried. You've lain in bed like a good wife, endured your husband's drunken fumblings, drank every bitter herbal tea the midwife handed you, and prayed until your knees turned red. And still, nothing. Your belly stays flat. Your monthly bleeding comes like clockwork, taunting you each time with its cruel regularity. And now the whispers have started. Because in Tudor England, if you can't get pregnant, the blame lands squarely in your lap. Not metaphorically, literally, it's your fault. Your broken womb, your sinful thoughts, your body's failure to do the one thing it's supposed to be good at. And let's be clear, it doesn't matter if your husband is ancient, impotent, riddled with venereal disease, or too drunk most nights to even manage the act. You're the woman, therefore you are the problem. The pressure is relentless. Your husband's family is watching. Your mother-in-law drops increasingly passive-aggressive hints about how she had 5 children by your age. The midwife tightens her lips when she examines you. Even your friends look at you sideways, with that combination of pity and judgment that burns more than outright scorn. People start to wonder if God is punishing you. Maybe you're barren because you were impure before marriage. Maybe you're cursed. Maybe you're a secret witch. Maybe your womb is shriveled from pride. Here's your historical fact. Infertility in Tudor England wasn't just a personal issue. It was a social crisis, especially for the upper classes. Marriages were often about producing heirs. If no heir arrived within a few years, it could threaten property lines, inheritance, and political alliances. This wasn't just family gossip, this was land, power, legacy, and if the marriage failed to produce children, well, the wife was the most obvious piece to replace. Some noblemen petitioned for annulments based on their wives' inabilities to perform the marital act, which is rich considering many of these men could barely perform themselves. But impotence was rarely discussed publicly. Instead, the woman's body was scrutinised like livestock. Did she menstruate too much? Not enough? Was her blood too cold, too thick? Did her womb tilt the wrong way? Yes, that was a real theory, retroverted uterus and all. She might be sent to a physician, a priest, or a particularly nosy herbalist, all of whom had wildly different and equally useless opinions. Now for your fringe fact. One old folk remedy for infertility involved holding a peeled apple slice between your thighs during church service, then burying it under the full moon in the garden. The idea was that the apple, a symbol of fertility, would absorb your body's essence and encourage conception. Other remedies involved rabbit dung, rooster feathers, or, wait for it, drinking wine that had been stirred with a man's severed finger bone. Science. Meanwhile, if you did manage to conceive but then lost the baby, the shame was equally intense. Miscarriage wasn't seen as tragic. It was seen as suspicious. Maybe you fell on purpose. Maybe you drank something. Maybe you wanted to get rid of it. It didn't matter how many weeks along you were or how devastating it felt. You were a failed vessel, a cracked jar, and the world reminded you of it at every turn. Some historians argue that midwives were more compassionate than doctors, closer to the women, more experienced in the messy, painful realities of childbirth. And that may be true, but even they carried the weight of societal expectation. If a woman miscarried, midwives were often the ones pressured to explain why. Sometimes they blamed cold wombs or a fright during pregnancy, hearing a sudden loud noise, for example, or seeing a dead animal. But often they blamed the woman's behaviour. You worked too hard, you ate the wrong foods, you had impure thoughts, your womb rebelled. And if you were suspected of purposely ending the pregnancy, things got dark fast. Abortion, while rarely discussed outright, was whispered about in alleyways and behind closed doors. Some women, desperate, terrified, turned to certain herbal concoctions known to bring on a period. Pennyroyal, rue, savin, tansy, these weren't always effective and they were dangerous. Take too little and nothing happens, take too much and your liver shuts down. And if anyone caught you using these herbs, or even suspected it, you could be accused of murder. Because let's be honest, Tudor England didn't care much about you. It cared about your ability to produce male heirs. You were expected to give birth early, often and without complaint. If your baby died, that was your fault. If you died in childbirth, that was unfortunate, but hardly unexpected. And if you lived without ever producing a child, you were considered incomplete. You were whispered about, pitied, or worse, ignored entirely. Let's take a moment to remember Queen Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII, devout, intelligent, deeply committed to her marriage. She suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, and only one child survived infancy, Mary, a girl. That wasn't good enough. Henry wanted a son, a male heir. And when Catherine couldn't give him one, he spent years manoeuvring to have their marriage annulled, dragging her through public disgrace and political warfare, and she was a queen. So imagine what they'd do to you. There's a scholarly debate about how common infertility actually was. Some suggest rates were lower than today due to the lack of hormonal disruptions from environmental toxins or processed food. Others argued it was widespread, masked by high infant mortality and social pressure to hide reproductive struggles. What's certain is that the emotional toll was devastating, even if no one used the words we use now. Grief, trauma, depression. You just got labelled barren, a failure, an embarrassment to your husband. You might try again and again and again, hoping each time that this one sticks, hoping your body cooperates, hoping your prayers are heard, and each month your blood comes, you feel yourself shrinking, disappearing, becoming invisible to the world. Your worth seeps out with it. And yet through it all, no one asks how you feel. Not really. You're expected to be strong, silent, penitent, maybe next month, maybe the next, maybe not. But whatever happens, you'll carry the shame alone. Because in Tudor England, a woman's body isn't just her own. It's a public project, a national concern, and if it doesn't perform, the world decides you failed. But don't worry. If the shame doesn't get you, the childbirth probably will. Ready for a nice long scream into the abyss? Because up next, labour. And it is every bit as bad as you think. There's a heaviness in your belly now, a fullness that shifts when you walk and makes you groan when you lie down. You're pregnant again, and this time the baby seems to be holding on. You've been lucky so far, or unlucky, depending on how you feel about the idea of childbirth in a world without painkillers, antiseptics, or even a halfway sterile towel. Because here it comes, the grand finale, the main event. You're about to give birth in Tudor England, and let me tell you, if you're not terrified, you're not paying attention. The first pang hits you in the early morning, somewhere between pouring out the chamber pot and boiling gruel. It starts in your back, a low hot pressure that doesn't go away. Then it creeps forward, wrapping around your abdomen like an iron belt. You pause, breathe, tell yourself it's probably nothing, just a cramp. You've had 6 false alarms already. But this one's different. This one builds. Someone runs to fetch the midwife. If you're lucky, she's local, competent and sober. If you're not, well, she's whoever happens to be nearby. There's no certification, no standard training, just years of experience passed down in whispers, and a collection of rusty tools and suspicious herbs that may or may not help. She arrives with her birthing kit, a bundle of cloth, some cord, a knife that looks like it's seen more pigs than people, and starts barking orders. Water, towels, silence. You're moved to the lying-in chamber, a small darkened room prepared weeks ago. The windows are covered. The fire's lit. Candles glow like soft ghosts on the walls. The idea is to create a warm, quiet, womb-like space. No sudden noises, no bright lights. The belief is that disruption might startle the baby or offend your body's mysterious processes. And maybe it helps. Or maybe it's just one more superstition to distract everyone from how truly terrifying this is. Here's your historical fact. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women during the Tudor period. Infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labour, retained placenta, any of these could kill you. And they often did. There were no antibiotics, no epidurals, no caesarean sections, unless you count the emergency ones performed only when the mother was already dying or dead, done with a knife and prayer. You went into labour knowing full well you might not come out of it alive. The pain escalates. It grips you like a storm, waves of pressure crashing through your body again and again, dragging screams from your throat. There's no breathing method, no coaching, no quiet whisper that you're doing great. Just the midwife shouting for you to push. Sometimes your mother or a neighbour is there, holding your hand. Sometimes you bite down on a leather strap to keep from breaking your teeth. You feel like you're being torn in half, and in a way you are. And here's your fringe fact. One common Tudor childbirth aid was to tie a piece of blessed bread around your neck, or hang a charm on the wall, made from a splinter of the true cross, which, let's be honest, was probably just some old wood someone found in the yard. The church offered special prayers for women in labour, and priests might anoint you if things got dicey. You were straddling 2 worlds now, life and death, heaven and earth, and everyone knew it. The room is hot, close, stinking of sweat, blood and burning herbs. You lose track of time, minutes melt into hours, hours into a haze of pain and panic. The midwife keeps reaching between your legs, muttering things you don't understand. Is the baby in the right position? Is it stuck? Is it breathing? No one tells you anything, they just keep telling you to push. And here's where it gets really medieval. If the baby is breech or too big or the labour stalls, there's very little anyone can do. The midwife might try to turn it manually, yes, inside you, using her bare hands. If the baby dies inside you, she may have to break the body apart to remove it. It's as horrifying as it sounds. And if you start bleeding too much afterward, if the placenta doesn't come out, if your body goes into shock, your chances of survival plummet. They might bleed you, they might feed you warm ale, they might press a dead frog to your stomach, because yes, that was a thing, but none of it really works. You survive if your body decides to let you. That's it. There's a scholarly debate about whether childbirth was purely terrifying for Tudor women, or if, in some twisted way, it also gave them power. After all, this was the one area of life where women were in charge. Midwives, mothers, female friends. Men were kept out. The birthing chamber was a female-only zone, a rare space of female authority built on shared pain. But that authority came at a steep price, and the risk never went away. Finally, mercifully, the baby comes. Maybe with a scream, maybe silent, maybe whole, maybe not. The midwife slaps its back. You hear a cry or you don't. And in that moment, time slows. If it's alive, everyone exhales. If it's dead, well, people try not to meet your eyes. There's no burial for stillborns, no ceremony. It's considered a spiritual failure as much as a biological one. You might not even be allowed to mourn. And then there's you, torn, bleeding, weak. You lie back on the soaked sheets while the midwife tends to you with ointments and cloths that sting like fire. There's no anaesthesia, just grit and salt. You might develop a fever in the coming days. If it spikes, everyone starts to whisper. Childbed fever, they say, an invisible poison in your blood. Another death by infection, unnoticed until it's too late. There's nothing they can do but pray. If you survive, congratulations. You've passed the ultimate test. People will call you strong, godly. They might bring you a pottage and a smile, but you'll be expected to get up soon. There are meals to cook, diapers to boil, another pregnancy looming around the corner. No one will ask if you're scared to go through it all again. You don't get to be scared, you get to be grateful. Because in Tudor England, childbirth isn't a miracle, it's a gauntlet, and you either make it to the other side or you don't. You survive. You shouldn't have, statistically speaking, but you do. The baby lives too, tiny, purple, and squalling, swaddled in rough wool, and tucked against your chest as though love alone will keep it alive. The midwife gives you a nod like you've just passed a brutal test, but there's no rest. Not really. You're expected to recover quietly, like nothing happened. A little lying in, sure. A few days of warm broth and whispered prayers, but soon you're back on your feet, back to stoking fires, tending to goats, and mending clothes with fingers that still tremble from blood loss. But here's the thing no one warns you about. Along with the baby comes an entire social surveillance team. Your mother-in-law, the midwife, the neighbours, even that one weird aunt who smells like cloves and damp linen. They're watching you now, every step, every groan, every sigh. And when you're not looking, they're talking. Because while you've managed to grow, carry and deliver an entire human being, your work is far from done. You now have to perform motherhood, and perform it correctly, or risk becoming the village's favourite new topic of scandal. Let's talk about the midwife, because she is, in many ways, the beating heart of Tudor childbirth, and sometimes its sharpest knife. She's the one who brought you through the storm. She wiped your brow with her cracked hands. She muttered charms while you screamed into the mattress. She cut the cord, weighed the baby, and cleaned up the mess. But don't let that fool you into thinking she's entirely on your side. Because she also knows everything. Everything. She knows when you cried out your husband's name, and when you didn't. She knows what position you gave birth in. She knows how hard you bled, and whether your baby looked full term or not. Here's your historical fact. Midwives were respected, powerful, and also deeply entangled with local authority. They were often required to report irregularities, anything suspicious, sinful, or socially problematic to the church or town officials. If your labour was unusually long, if your baby looked wrong, or if you muttered strange words while in pain, she might mention it to the parish priest. Not because she wants to betray you necessarily, but because it's her job to uphold moral order. Childbirth wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, political, public. And here's the fringe detail. Some midwives actually carried small books where they recorded the circumstances of each birth. Details like the mother's behaviour, the size and health of the baby, even the sounds made during labour. Why? So they could later defend their professional reputation if anything went wrong. If a child died or a woman was accused of sin, that record could clear or condemn them both. You think you're just giving birth in pain and privacy, but nope, you're starring in a full-on community audit. Now let's talk rumours, because they start the moment you leave the lying-in chamber. Maybe someone thinks the baby looks a little too fair, or not fair enough. Maybe a neighbour remembers that time she saw you in the woods with a man who wasn't your husband, 2 years ago, when the moon was high and the air smelled like rain. That's all it takes. People start to whisper that maybe this child isn't legitimate. Maybe the dates don't add up. Maybe your husband isn't the father. And what if your baby doesn't survive? Maybe it's born too small, too blue, too silent. You're grieving, bleeding, falling apart, and now you have to answer questions. What did you eat? What did you do? What did you do? Did you lift a heavy bucket? Did you get angry? Did you sin? Maybe the baby was taken as punishment. Maybe God saw something in you that needed correcting. Your sorrow becomes another form of guilt. Your mourning a suspicion. There's a bitter scholarly debate about how much trust women could place in their midwives. Some argue that midwives were allies, experienced, motherly figures who offered support in a cruel patriarchal system. Others point to court records where midwives testified against their patients, accusing them of fornication, sorcery, or infanticide. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. These women were both caretakers and gatekeepers, operating under immense pressure themselves, trying to stay afloat in a world ready to blame them for every crooked limb or cursed birth. And then there's the naming. Within a day or two, assuming the baby is healthy, it's time for the christening. You're barely able to stand, but you're expected to dress and appear at the church, where your child will be officially welcomed into the faith. The priest says the rites in Latin, the godparents present the baby, and water is poured over its head. If the child dies before this can happen, the church says it might not go to heaven, so the pressure is on. You can't delay, can't wait until you feel better. Your spiritual failure could doom your baby's soul. No pressure. Afterward, you might host a small celebration, if you're well off, or just collapse in bed if you're not. Your body still aches. Your breasts are swollen and leaking. You're learning how to breastfeed by trial and error, and everyone has an opinion. Hold the baby this way, wrap her tighter. Don't let her fall asleep while feeding. And heaven forbid you decide not to breastfeed at all. That opens up an entire new chapter of scandal. Who's feeding the child? A wet nurse? Is she clean? Is she moral? Is she Catholic? Meanwhile, the midwife is still watching. She notices if your milk doesn't come in, if your child cries too much, if you seem distant or overly emotional. There's no word for postpartum depression. There's no treatment, no safe place to say, I feel like I'm drowning. You're expected to glow, to smile, to rise from your blood-soaked sheets and cook dinner with your newborn strapped to your chest. If you complain, you're dramatic. If you cry, you're unstable. If you falter even for a moment, someone will talk. And the midwife, she'll know, and what she knows becomes what everyone knows. Because in Tudor England, giving birth doesn't just make you a mother, it makes you public property. Your body, your choices, your emotions, all fair game for scrutiny. The birth might be over, but the judgment has just begun. And next, you better hope you bled enough on your wedding night, because if not, you're going to be asked to prove it, with a stained sheet and your entire reputation hanging in the balance. You've made it through marriage, pregnancy, childbirth, and the unspoken social Olympics of Tudor motherhood. You'd think you'd earned a break, but no. There's one more gauntlet, one more humiliating ritual you can't avoid, proving your virginity. Because even though your marriage is already legal, your wedding has already happened, and your baby might already be squalling in the corner, there are still some people who need evidence that your body entered this holy union untouched. And that evidence, of course, must be delivered in the form of a blood-stained sheet. Yes, a literal sheet. And if this sounds like something out of a particularly cringy high school health class myth, sorry to say, this was very much a real thing. In many parts of Tudor England, especially among the nobility and upper classes, it was customary, sometimes even expected, for the new bride and groom's marital bed to be checked the morning after the wedding. Not just for idle gossip, but for official confirmation that the bride had been a virgin and that the marriage had been physically consummated. That's right, you're not officially a wife until there's blood on linen to prove it. Let's start with the basics. The hymen, that mysterious, misunderstood little piece of tissue. In Tudor medical understanding, it was treated as a kind of purity seal, a thin veil meant to break upon first penetration, releasing a symbolic and hopefully visible drop or two of blood. Problem is, not all women bleed the first time. Some have hymens that stretch or break earlier, from horseback riding, dancing, or even a particularly vigorous climb over a fence. And some don't have much tissue at all. But try explaining that to a crowd of Tudor relatives eager to inspect your bedclothes, like forensic scientists at a murder scene. Here's a historical fact. In high-stakes marriages, especially royal or noble unions, proof of virginity was more than just a matter of family pride. It was legal leverage. If the sheet wasn't bloody, the groom or his family could challenge the marriage, claim fraud, and even demand annulment. That meant returning the dowry, breaking off alliances, public disgrace. You could lose your status, your security, and your husband all in one blow. And the worst part? You couldn't really argue back. You had no way to prove you were pure. You could only hope your body played along. In some households, the sheet was presented proudly the morning after, carried like a battle flag through the halls. A servant might announce it. Guests might cheer. The mother-in-law might smile with smug satisfaction, clutching the stained cloth like a trophy. It was both gross and ceremonial, a strange mix of privacy violation and public celebration. And if there was no blood, well, that's when things turned sour. Enter the virginity test. If your new husband, or worse, your new in-laws, decided they weren't convinced of your untouched status, they could request a physical examination. Conducted by a midwife or a local expert, this test was as invasive and humiliating as you'd imagine. You'd be inspected for signs of prior sexual activity. Is your hymen intact? Does your body look too experienced? Did your breasts sag more than expected for a maiden? Yes, these were all actual considerations. Forget the fact that none of them are medically reliable. This was science by suspicion. Now here's your fringe fact. In some especially paranoid cases, the midwife might go one step further and ask if you could produce a special virgin's urine. That's right. They believed virgin urine was clearer, lighter and more refined. Some even compared it to morning dew. You might be asked to relieve yourself into a bowl so they could examine it for cloudiness, sediment, or any signs of prior sexual activity. You can't make this stuff up. And what happens if you fail the test? Well, that depends. If your family has money or power, they might smooth it over. Maybe the groom decides to let it slide. Maybe you fabricate a bloody sheet the next night with chicken's blood or a carefully prepared cloth soaked in wine. Yes, that happened too. Where there's pressure, there's creativity. But if you're not so lucky, you might be sent home in disgrace. You might be dragged into a church court for investigation. You might find yourself labelled unchaste, a reputation that will follow you forever. Good luck remarrying after that. There's a scholarly debate about how widespread these virginities tests and sheet inspections really were. Some historians argue that they were mostly reserved for high-status marriages, where alliances and inheritances were on the line. Others suggest that the obsession with female purity seeped into all levels of society, from manor to market stall, and that even among commoners a lack of blood on the wedding sheet could provoke suspicion and slander. What's clear is this. The fear of being seen as impure was enough to keep most women walking a very tight, very lonely line. And this wasn't just about sex, it was about power. Because when your worth is tied to something as intangible and inconsistent as purity, you're always vulnerable. One accusation, one rumour, one bad night, and your entire life can collapse. You become defenceless against judgment, because there's no evidence that can truly protect you. Your body becomes a crime scene. Your innocence a riddle no one believes you can answer. Think about it. Men didn't have to prove anything. No one checked their sheets. No one examined their bodies for signs of previous lovers. In fact, having sexual experience often made a groom more desirable. He was worldly, strong, capable. But a woman, if she knew too much, if she seemed too confident, if she didn't flinch at the right moment, that was cause for alarm. Because purity wasn't just about abstinence. It was about performance. You had to look innocent, sound innocent, bleed on cue. And if you managed to make it through this bizarre obstacle course of social scrutiny, if you delivered the right evidence at the right time, congratulations. You could breathe, for now, but only until the next round of inspections begins, because your body will be under watch for the rest of your life. Every child you bear, every miscarriage, every missed period. Every time you smile at the wrong man for a beat too long, it never ends. So sleep tight under that clean, unstained sheet tonight. Just know someone might check it in the morning. Your child is crying again. Of course they are. You haven't slept in days, and your breasts feel like overfilled wineskins on the verge of bursting. You rock the baby gently, humming a lullaby your mother taught you, the same one she sang after each of her dozen deliveries. Around you the cottage creaks and shifts. The fire's gone out. There's a rat rustling in the corner. The baby coughs. And you wonder, not for the first time, what happens if your child doesn't make it. What becomes of a baby born out of wedlock? Or worse, a woman who dares to have one? Because here's another delightful facet of Tudor life. Illegitimacy ruins everything. And not just for the child. If you, as a woman, give birth outside the boundaries of marriage, it brands your life with a scarlet A, so bright even your descendants might feel it. No rights, no inheritance, no protection. The baby is considered filius nullius, a child of no one. You're called worse, much worse. Say you're unmarried and pregnant. You've somehow slipped past all the watching eyes. Or maybe you were coerced, or maybe you just loved someone you weren't supposed to. It doesn't matter. What matters is that your belly swells and there's no husband in sight. Maybe the man promised to marry you and fled. Maybe he's noble and you're not. Maybe he's your employer, and your silence was never really a choice. Still, you are the one held accountable. Here's a historical fact. Bastards, as they were legally termed, had no claim to inheritance unless specifically legitimised by the king, and that almost never happened. For nobles that meant no land, no titles, no future. For commoners it meant a lifetime of being treated as less than. Illegitimate children couldn't join certain guilds, enter the clergy, or attend school in many places. They were often listed in records with phrases like born of sin or natural child, as if their existence were a moral stain. But the real burden falls on the mother. If you give birth out of a wedlock, you might be hauled before the church courts. There you'd be charged with fornication, incontinence, or lechery. First offence, public penance. You'd stand outside the church barefoot in a shift holding a candle, while your neighbours filed in to attend mass. Second offence, fines, whipping, imprisonment. If you were poor and couldn't pay the fine, the punishment might be corporal. Imagine that, being beaten for loving the wrong person, or simply being unlucky enough to carry the evidence. Now here's your fringe fact. Some towns kept public birthing stools or stocks specifically for unwed mothers to give birth in, as a form of humiliation. That's right, labour wasn't just painful, it was performative shame. You were seen as a cautionary tale, a walking sermon against sin, and after the child was born, the judgment didn't end. You could be refused charity, refused housing, refused work, especially if it happened more than once, because now you're not just a fallen woman, you're reckless. If you tried to hide the pregnancy, dangerous, illegal. If the child died, whether by miscarriage, stillbirth or accident, the suspicion was immediate. Maybe you smothered it, maybe you exposed it, maybe you drowned it. Women were frequently accused of infanticide, and the line between misfortune and crime was razor thin. Some scholars suggest that infanticide laws were less about protecting babies and more about controlling female sexuality, because a woman with no way to prove who the father was seen as a threat to social order. And yes, they did sometimes execute women for it. Hanged, burned, or left to rot in prison. All because they were alone, unsupported, and unable to defend themselves against a world that only listened to men. The man who fathered the child, often unpunished. If you were lucky, he'd admit paternity and offer a small payment, known as child support, though it was meagre and rarely enforced. If you weren't lucky, he'd disappear and you'd be stuck. There's some scholarly debate over how harsh Tudor society really was to unwed mothers. Some argue that in rural communities, especially among the poor, illegitimacy was common and quietly tolerated. Neighbours helped each other, midwives kept secrets, grandparents raised the babies. The system looked the other way. Others point to the sheer volume of court cases, penance records, and punishments as proof that the judgment was real, institutionalised, and brutal. Either way, the message was clear. Motherhood outside marriage was a sin, and sinners paid dearly. But let's say you managed to survive the childbirth and keep your baby alive through the winter. Now what? You've got no husband, no home, no money. You might turn to begging, or worse, to sex work, which only feeds the cycle. If you're caught with another child out of wedlock, the punishment worsens. A second offence might earn you a branding, a hot iron pressed to your skin to usually your cheek or hand, a permanent mark of your failure. And the child? They grow up in shadow, denied opportunities, denied status. If you're noble, your bastard might be raised in secret, hidden away in a country house, or sent to serve in a monastery. If you're poor, the childhood may be passed around between relatives, given away or raised in a charity house. And they will always know they are illegitimate, a word that follows them like a curse. Some women tried to escape this fate. They married quickly, even if it meant wedding a man old enough to be their father. They fled to new towns where no one knew their name. They forged marriage documents or claimed their child had been born early. Lies were sometimes the only form of protection a woman had. But not everyone escaped, and for many the shame didn't fade. Even decades later, an old midwife or neighbour could expose your secret. And in Tudor England, your reputation is fragile glass. Once cracked, it never fully repairs. So you rock your baby a little tighter. You kiss their tiny forehead and whisper promises you're not sure you can keep. Because while they may be your joy, your hope, your everything, they're also your risk, your ruin. And every day you raise them is a quiet defiance against a world that said neither of you should have survived. And speaking of survival, how about the women who did this work every day, who walked the knife's edge between demand and disdain? Next up, brothels, boils, and the brutal life of Tudor sex workers. You think it's grim now? We're just getting started. The street smells like rotten onions and damp wool. A chamber pot's just been emptied from the window as above, splattering loudly onto the cobblestones. No one bothers warning anymore. You walk fast, keeping your eyes low, your shawl pulled tight. This part of town is known for two things, disease and desire. And if you're here, it's probably not by choice. This is Southwark Walk, London's favourite den of vice, and brothels are as common as bakeries. Welcome to the other side of Tudor sexuality, where sex isn't just obligation, but business. And for the women working it, it's a brutal, relentless, and often deadly trade. Let's not pretend this is glamorous. There are no feather beds or sultry looks across flickering candles. The stews, as brothels were called, are crowded, filthy, and constantly under threat of raid. The women here aren't courtesans in silk, they're poor, desperate, and often just teenagers trying to survive. Some were born into this life, some were abandoned, others were widows, cast out with no dowry and no prospects. For many this was the last option before starvation. It's sex work, Tudor style, and it's about as far from fantasy as you can get. Here's a real historical fact. Brothels in Southwark operated under a bizarre semi-legal status for much of the Tudor period. Technically illegal under church law, they were still licensed and regulated by the Bishop of Winchester, who collected rents and fines from them. Hence the term Winchester geese, used to describe the women who worked there. It's one of history's great hypocrisies. The same institution that condemned fornication helped fund itself with the profits of it. The conditions are horrific. You live in one cramped room, maybe shared with another girl. The bed is used, reused, and rarely cleaned. You service 5, 10, maybe more clients a day. Sailors, labourers, apprentices, even priests. They pay with coin, bread, favours. There are no protections, no privacy, no medical care, and very little kindness. If you're lucky, the madam likes you. If not, you might be beaten or tossed out the door if you fall ill or age past your usefulness. The average lifespan of a sex worker in this era? Pathetically smut short. And here's your fringe fact. One of the most infamous diseases passed around these brothels was referred to in Tudor slang as the pox. We know it now as syphilis, and it was rampant. Painful sores, rashes, swollen joints, madness. Without treatment, and there wasn't really treatment, it could rot your body and your brain. The cure, if you can call it that, was mercury. Yes, mercury. You'd be locked in a hot room slathered in mercury ointment till your gums turned black and your teeth fell out. You might live, you might not. Either way, you'd be left half melted. And yet, despite the danger, brothels flourished. Demand was never short. Men from all walks of life came looking for release, some because they could, others because they couldn't find it at home. Wives were expected to be modest and passive. Brothel women were the opposite. They knew what men wanted, or at least they pretended to. And for a few coins, they offered escape from the relentless moral grind of daily life. It wasn't pleasure so much as transaction. There's a strange duality in how these women were viewed. On the one hand, they were needed. a necessary sin. On the other, they were despised, dirty, dangerous, disease-ridden. They were denied burial in consecrated ground. They were spat on in public, and if caught outside the tolerated zones or found working unlicensed, they could be whipped, branded, or imprisoned in the local bridewell, a prison specifically for fallen women. Some were even forced to wear iron masks with spiked mouthpieces, meant to silence and shame them. And yet the hypocrisy never ended. Some of the same men who visited brothels on Saturday sat in the front pew on Sunday. Priests railed against sin while collecting rents from the stews. Young apprentices warned about loose women even as they lined up outside the doors. These women were used, punished and blamed, all while quietly keeping the gears of the city turning. Because for all its preaching about chastity, Tudor society ran on sexual exploitation like a leaky ship runs on patchwork. There's a scholarly debate about agency here. How much power did these women really have? Some argue that certain brothel workers managed to carve out pockets of control. They negotiated rates, built loyal clienteles, even saved money. A few rose to positions of power within the brothels themselves, acting as madams or landlords. But for the vast majority there was no long game, no escape plan, just another night of aching limbs, putrid breath, and the dread of the next knock on the door. And if you got pregnant, that was its own horror show. Maybe you hid it as long as you could. Maybe you tried to abort using herbs or dangerous old wives' brews. Maybe you gave birth in secret, stuffed rags in your mouth to keep from screaming. If the baby survived, you might give it away. If it didn't, well then you'd better hope no one found out. Because if a sex worker was discovered with a dead child, the assumption was always murder. And still, despite all this, some of these women laughed, sang songs, formed bonds with each other, painted their faces with crushed berries and ash and pretended for one night to be someone else. They had favourite clients, maybe even fleeting romances. Some wrote letters, some dreamed of escape, and some, few but real, actually chose this life, deciding it was better than marriage to a man who'd beat them or a field that would break their back. But for most, there was no choice, just survival. One day to the next, one man to the next. The same breathless shuffle between being seen and being discarded. So the next time you hear someone romanticise the merry wives and buxom wenches of ye olde England, remember the truth. There's nothing merry about being used up and thrown away, nothing buxom about bruises and boils and broken teeth. And speaking of being demonised for wanting or just surviving sex, let's move on to something even darker. The woman who doesn't marry, doesn't serve, doesn't bear children and doesn't apologise. You know the one. They call her a witch. There's a chill in the air tonight that has nothing to do with weather. The wind sighs through the village like it knows something you don't. A black cat darts across the path, a dog howls. Someone murmurs a prayer under their breath. And at the edge of town, in a crumbling cottage half covered in moss, lives a woman. Everyone pretends not to see. She's old, she's single, she talks to herself. Maybe she helped deliver a baby once or sold herbs in the market. Maybe she just didn't marry or married and outlived the man. Either way, she's become that woman. The one you cross the road to avoid. The one who looks too long, knows too much and dares to live outside the rules. The one they call a witch. In Tudor England, being called a witch wasn't about flying broomsticks or cackling into a cauldron. It was often about being a woman who didn't behave. And one of the easiest ways to earn suspicion? Owning your sexuality. Or even worse, not needing a man at all. If you were unmarried past a certain age, widowed and not remarried, or just a little too confident in your own independence, people started watching you. Closely. There's a real historical fact that ties it all together. Many of the women accused of witchcraft in Tudor England were older, single and often childless. These weren't the spooky sorceresses of modern fiction. They were poor women, often midwives, herbalists or healers. And you know what else they had in common? They didn't fit the mould. They weren't safely tucked into the role of wife, mother or obedient daughter. That made them dangerous, and dangerous women needed to be dealt with. You could earn a witch accusation for any number of things. Did a neighbour's cow die after you argued with her? Witch. Did someone's baby fall ill after you walked past their door? Witch. Did a man have an inappropriate dream about you and wake up ashamed? Obviously, you bewitched him. Your hair, your eyes, your smile could be used against you. Your body wasn't just a source of scandal, it became a source of fear, a tool of the devil. And here's your fringe fact. One popular test for witches involved checking for a witch's teat, a mark on the body that was believed to be a secret nipple used to feed demons or familiars. It could be a mole, a scar, a birthmark. Something as simple as a freckle in the wrong place could damn you. Witch hunters would strip you naked and examine every inch of your skin, often with a needle, to see if the spot bled or felt pain. If it didn't, that was proof you were feeding your little demonic friend with it. And again, let's be clear, this wasn't just about religion. This was about control. A woman with knowledge of herbs, of childbirth, of sex, of male weakness. She was a threat, especially if she wasn't pretty enough to charm, rich enough to protect, or pious enough to silence suspicion. These accusations weren't about justice. They were about social convenience. A way to eliminate women who refuse to conform, to humiliate them, strip them of dignity, and remind every other woman watching exactly what happens when you step out of line. There's a scholarly debate about whether most witch trials were really about sexuality, or more about economics and neighbourly feuds. The answer is yes. It was all of it. Your body, your land, your attitude, your independence. The moment you became troublesome, you were vulnerable. Women who took lovers out of wedlock were doubly suspect. Women who didn't take lovers at all? Suspicious and unnatural. It was the ultimate lose-lose. Let's say you're accused. It starts with a whisper, then a formal complaint. You're summoned to court, church or town, depending on who you offended. You're asked impossible questions. Have you made a pact with the devil? Have you cursed any animals? Why do you live alone? They want a confession, and they'll push until you give it. Sleep deprivation, public shaming. Sometimes physical torture, though that was technically illegal in England at the time. Keyword technically. The threat alone was often enough. If you confess, you might be imprisoned, fined, forced to do public penance. If you refuse, it could end with your death. Hanging, most often not burning, that's a myth imported from the continent. But death is death, and it's usually preceded by weeks of fear, pain and isolation. Even if you survive the accusation, you're marked for life. People won't buy from you, they won't speak to you. Children are warned to stay away. You become a living ghost. And here's the extra stinger. Sometimes being too sexually appealing also got you accused. If you were seen as flirtatious, if men were drawn to you, if you had a reputation for being loose, you were labelled a temptress. If your beauty made someone lustful, that was proof of your demonic powers. You caused his thoughts, his dreams, his disgrace. Your face becomes a crime, your hips a weapon, your voice a spell. So whether you lived alone and unloved, or were loved a little too visibly, the target was still painted on your back. There was no safe path, no way to be a woman in full possession of your body and not be punished for it. And remember, most of these women weren't witches, they were just women. Widows, healers, former servants, survivors. But once branded, they were symbols. Warnings to others: keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, keep your knees together. Because stepping out of the line might not just get you scolded, it might get you killed. So next time someone jokes about witches in pointy hats, think of her, the old woman on the edge of town, once young, once loved, once loud, now silent. Not because she had power, but because she wanted some. And speaking of silence, what about the women who chose celibacy, who swore off sex entirely, not out of fear or shame, but for faith? Did it liberate them, or trap them in a different kind of prison? Let's shift the candlelight now to another kind of Tudor woman, one who at first glance seems to have sidestepped the whole wretched mess of sex, childbirth and the parade of humiliations tied to marriage. She's not writhing in labour, she's not scrubbing blood from sheets, she's not being dragged before a church court for bedding the neighbour's apprentice. Instead, she's kneeling in a stone-cold chapel, hands folded, eyes shut, lips whispering endless Latin. She's a nun, or at least trying to become one, and for a fleeting second, you think maybe she got the better deal. No husband, no children, no rope bed fumbles in the dark. Just prayer, peace, and maybe a cat or two. But don't get too cosy, because while celibacy might spare your body, it does a number on your soul and your sanity. Joining a convent in Tudor England isn't as simple as pulling on a habit and vanishing into spiritual bliss. First, you need money, lots of it. A dowry for the church, that's right. Just like a marriage, becoming a bride of Christ requires a financial transaction. If your family can't afford it, tough luck. Back to the marriage market with you. And if you're sent to a convent young, say as a second or third daughter with no inheritance, your consent isn't necessarily required. You're bundled off like a problem solved. Here's a historical fact. Nearest before the Reformation, England had over 800 religious houses for monks and nuns. These were centres of education and charity, and yes, female autonomy of Homer to a degree. Women in convents could read, write, study scripture, and sometimes even run their own affairs. Some became abbesses wielding serious power over land and money. For a moment in time, it was one of the few places a woman could live outside a man's shadow and still maintain respect. But it came at a cost. And not just the silence and the prayers. Celibacy wasn't just a vow, it was an identity. You renounced your body, your desires, your autonomy. You fasted. You wore hair shirts to punish your flesh. You were told that your thoughts, your longings, your dreams were sins if they wandered too far from the crucifix. You weren't simply avoiding sex, you were trained to loathe the very idea of it. Your womb became a wilderness you were supposed to ignore. And here's your fringe fact. Some religious women were said to suffer from something called amor divinus, a wholly overwhelming desire for union with God that was described in wildly sensual terms. These women had ecstatic visions, felt divine embraces, even claimed to hear Christ's voice in their sleep. In the margins of their private diaries and prayer books, you can still find entries that read more like love letters than scripture. Historians debate whether this was true spiritual experience or sublimated erotic desire, but either way, it was intense, and not always safe. A nun who became too passionate, too enthusiastic in her spiritual love might be accused of heresy or possession. Even celibate women weren't safe from suspicion. Then comes the Reformation, and things really fall apart. When Henry VIII breaks from the Catholic Church and starts dismantling the monasteries, those quiet stone refuges vanish almost overnight. Nuns are turned out of their homes. Some are allowed to marry, awkwardly, reluctantly, often in shame. Others live out the rest of their lives in poverty. Suddenly being celibate is no longer noble. It's weird, suspicious, almost foreign. The very thing that once elevated these women now isolates them. They're seen as leftover relics of a corrupt past. There's a scholarly debate about what celibacy meant for women during this time. Was it genuinely liberating, freedom from childbirth, from forced sex, from marital servitude? Or was it just another form of repression, dressed up in divine language? The answer is complicated. Some women genuinely found solace in the spiritual life. They read, wrote, and led with power that married women could only dream of. Others were dumped into convents as a form of control, tucked out of sight like inconvenient heirlooms, and for most it was likely both. A cage with velvet walls. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Just because you swore off sex doesn't mean sex left you alone. Celibate women were often the targets of scandal, especially if they showed too much emotion or spent too much time alone with other women. Affection was scrutinized. Friendship was dissected. Two nuns praying together too often might be accused of unnatural intimacy. And if you dared to express frustration, longing, anger, well, that was just proof your vow had failed. You weren't holy. You were hysterical. Let's not forget the men either. Celibate priests, monks and friars had their own mess to deal with. Temptation, guilt, scandal. But they weren't viewed with the same level of paranoia. A monk who slipped was human. A nun who slipped was damned. And the church never let you forget it. So you sit in your cell, cold and aching, with calloused knees and a candle burnt low. You've given your body to silence. You've handed your future over to the altar. And some days it feels like peace, like escape. Other days it feels like slow spiritual erosion. Like being whittled down by centuries of prayers you barely understand. The absence of touch becomes its own kind of wound. But at least you're safe, right? At least you're not birthing child after child in a blood-stained bed. At least no one's checking your sheets or sniffing around your door. And yet, they still talk. They wonder, they imagine, they invent stories. Because even when you remove yourself from the game entirely, the world still finds a way to sexualize you. You can't win, you just disappear. So what do you choose? Submission or solitude? One offers a brutal kind of purpose, the other a quiet kind of erasure. And either way, your body never truly belongs to you. Which brings us to the men who set all this in motion. The king with the wandering eyes, the obsessive quest for a male heir, and the uncanny ability to destroy every woman who dared to share his bed. Yes, it's time. Let's talk about Henry VIII. And ladies, brace yourselves. You know his name before you ever see his face. Everyone does. He's the reason people speak in hushed tones near the chapel, the reason women clutch their crucifixes a little tighter and men sharpen their flattery like knives. Henry Tudor. Henry VIII, if you're being formal. The man with the crown and the appetites. The king whose love life reads less like a romance and more like a 6-part true crime series. And if you think marriage in Tudor England was already a gamble, wait until you're sleeping with the king. Henry VIII is the kind of man who doesn't just walk into a room, he dominates it. He's tall for the time, broad-shouldered, booming in voice and confidence. He laughs loudly, hunts often, and eats like a warhorse. He's clever, cultured, even charming at first. But beneath the velvet and pageantry is a man so consumed by obsession that he will twist religion, rewrite law, and literally behead his own wife to get what he wants. And what he wants always is a son. So what does that mean for you, a woman at court? Well, it means you smile. Carefully. You wear your best gown, but not one that suggests you're trying. You dance when asked, laugh at his jokes, and if you're wise, you avoid his gaze just long enough to seem virtuous. Because if he decides he wants you, your life is over, either in luxury, in tragedy, or in a swift, silent execution. Let's talk facts. Henry had 6 wives, and no, it wasn't all for love. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was married to his brother first. When Arthur died, Henry stepped in and eventually married her after some very creative theological manoeuvring. She was devout, loyal, and endured more miscarriages and stillbirths than most women survive. Only one child lived, Mary, a daughter. Not good enough. Enough. After nearly 2 decades of marriage, Henry decided Catherine hadn't done her job. He wanted an annulment. The Pope said no. Henry said, "Fine, I'll make my own church." That's your historical fact of the day. Henry VIII broke from the Roman Catholic Church, created the Church of England, and declared himself its supreme head, all so he could leave one wife and marry another. Religion, loyalty, and tradition were all just obstacles in his way, and every woman after Catherine would come to understand just how expendable a queen could be. Next was Anne Boleyn. Sharp-tongued, dark-haired, not particularly beautiful by court standards, but magnetic. She said no, over and over, and Henry loved it. She held out for marriage, and he gave it to her. But when she too failed to produce a male heir, the tides turned. Henry grew cold, Anne miscarried, likely due to stress or infection, and Henry accused her of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. Yes, witchcraft. As if her miscarried fetus was proof of a demonic pact. She was imprisoned, tried on fabricated charges, and beheaded by sword. Henry ordered a French executioner. Clean, elegant, fast. How thoughtful. And here's your fringe fact. Henry wore white the day after Anne's execution to celebrate his engagement to Jane Seymour. She gave him what he wanted, a son, Edward, but died from childbirth complications less than 2 weeks later. Henry mourned her more than any of the others, which isn't saying much. She was lucky, in the most tragic possible way. She gave him a son and died before she could disappoint him. Wife number 4, Anne of Cleves, was chosen from a painting. Literally. Henry sent an artist to Europe to find a suitable bride, and when Anne's portrait arrived, he was smitten. But when she showed up in person, he was horrified. She wasn't as pretty as he expected. He called her a Flanders mare. The marriage was never consummated, annulled quickly, and to Anne's eternal credit, she agreed to the annulment and walked away with a generous settlement, a few estates, and her head intact, one of the few to outmaneuver him. Then came Catherine Howard. Young, beautiful, flirtatious. Too flirtatious. Rumours of past lovers, scandalous letters, a flirtation with a courtier, none of which Henry appreciated. She was arrested, imprisoned, and beheaded at just 19. Henry didn't watch. He had grown tired of that part. Catherine's last words were a prayer. Her crime? Being too young, too desired, and not nearly afraid enough. And finally, Catherine Parr. Educated, older, twice widowed. She outlived him, mainly by staying quiet and being very good at soothing egos. She nearly got arrested for her reformist religious beliefs, but talked her way out of it. She nursed Henry in his final rotting years, managing his ulcers and his paranoia. She survived, but not without scars. There's a scholarly debate about how much these women knew going in. Were they naive, trapped, ambitious? The answer is yes, yes, and yes. Both were raised to be queens. Others were blindsided. All were subject to the whims of a man whose power made him unchallengeable. And yet they weren't just victims. Anne Boleyn reshaped English history. Catherine Parr published books. Even Jane Seymour in her brief life left a mark that changed the succession. But none of them had real control, not in the way Henry did, not in the way he decided who lived and who died. And what about the countless women who weren't queens? The ladies in waiting, the mistresses, the court dancers? Many were seduced, used and discarded. Some bore children in secret. Some were married off as rewards to other noblemen. Some were forgotten entirely. Henry's court wasn't just dangerous at the top, it was dangerous everywhere. If you were a woman, you lived one bad flirtation away from disaster. Because in Tudor England, desire wasn't just risky, it was deadly. And when a king had the power to rewrite the rules in real time, no one was safe. So after all that, you might wonder, what if your desires didn't fit into the neat man-woman script? What if your love, your longing, your secret glances were for someone the law and the church refused to acknowledge? What then? Well, then you'd better start burning those letters. Because next we're diving into the secret forbidden world of non-hetero love in Tudor times, where silence isn't just survival, it's everything. You've kept your distance, you've watched the court from the shadows, kept your smiles short, your eyes lower than need be. You've seen what happens to the women who step into the spotlight, how they're praised, paraded, possessed, and then, all too often, discarded. So you stay quiet, careful, you keep your secrets close, especially this one, that your heart, when it races, doesn't do so for any of the noblemen strutting around the hall in their puffed sleeves and peacock pride. It stirs for her. The woman who stands a little too close when she fixes your gown. The one who makes you laugh when everyone else leaves you cold. In Tudor England, love between women or men isn't just forbidden. It doesn't even have the language to exist. There is no gay in Tudor English, no lesbian, no queer. There are acts, sodomy, unnatural vice, lewdness, all punishable by shame, exile or death. But identities, relationships built on tenderness, longing, romance, those live in silence, or in code, or in letters burned before they can be read aloud. You learn quickly that desire, if it falls outside the rigid script of church-sanctioned marriage, must either disappear or disguise itself. There is no middle ground. Let's start with the men. Here's your historical fact. In 1533, Parliament passed the Buggery Act under Henry VIII. It was the first civil sodomy law in English history, and it made unnatural sexual acts punishable by death. The law didn't name specific acts in graphic detail. Tudor legislators weren't exactly progressive sex ed instructors, but everyone understood what it meant. Men caught having sex with men could be executed, and were, though not in huge numbers. The very existence of the law sent a clear message. Certain kinds of love would be met not just with disapproval, but with violence. Of course, most of these cases relied on accusations, often by enemies, jealous rivals or panicked lovers. Without physical evidence, which was hard to come by, many of these accusations were thrown out, but if someone had it out for you, all it took was a whisper. The most famous case for Walter Hungerford, 1st Baron Hungerford of Heytesbury. In 1540 he was executed, ostensibly for treason, but also accused of engaging in unnatural vice, a combination of political danger and sexual suspicion. Sound familiar? For women, things were murkier, less documented, less punished, but also less seen. Female sexuality was already treated like some half-understood ghost. The idea of women loving other women romantically, let alone sexually, didn't fully register with male authorities. Some relationships between women were ignored, brushed off as deep friendship or sisterly affection. Others, especially when they defied gender expectations, were viewed with suspicion. If you dressed in men's clothing, or were known to avoid marriage, or worse, live with another unmarried woman, people began to talk. Here's your fringe fact. In 1547, a woman named Eleanor Rykener was arrested in London while dressed as a man and reportedly engaging in sex work with both men and women. Her case appears in the court records as John Rykener, suggesting she lived at least part of her life presenting male. Her story, rare and exceptional, gives us a glimpse into the hidden lives of gender non-conforming individuals in the medieval and early modern period. Was she trans? Was she queer? Historians debate endlessly, but what's clear is that people like her existed, and they lived under constant threat. Now let's talk about how love survived anyway. If you're a man in love with another man, maybe you write him letters, coded, poetic, full of metaphors and biblical language. You call him David and yourself Jonathan. You reference Ruth and Naomi. You swear eternal friendship even as your hearts are beating against the bars of your own ribs. Maybe you kiss once in the dark. Maybe you spend your whole life pretending, or maybe you get lucky. You both marry women, keep up the facade, and exchange glances across the dinner table for decades. For women, the cloak of friendship is slightly thicker. Two women can live together as companions, share a bed for warmth, care for one another into old age, and most people will call it sweet, domestic, unremarkable, as long as no one says the word, as long as you never give them a reason to question. So maybe you do more. Maybe you find moments behind the garden wall at night, under the hush of candlelight, when the world falls away and you are just two bodies, two souls colliding gently. But afterward, you don't speak of it. You return to being cousins or roommates or special friends. Your love must always wear a mask. There's a scholarly debate about how widespread or understood queer relationships were in Tudor England. Some argue that the rigid religious codes left little room for anything outside heterosexual marriage. Others point to surviving poems, letters, and court records as proof that these loves existed, even if they couldn't name themselves. What's certain is that queerness did not appear suddenly in the 20th century. It lived, whispered, and persisted in every era, including this one. But the fear was real. If caught, you could lose everything. Your position at court, your property, your life. And for many, the silence became a kind of safety net. You learned to speak in half sentences, to read the shape of someone's eyes, to find your own reflection in another person's longing. You survived on stolen moments and unspoken truths. There's tragedy in that. But also something oddly heroic. Because in a world that said you didn't exist, that your love was a sickness, a crime, a sin, you loved anyway. Quietly, bravely, secretly. You carved out space in the margins. You created languages with your hands, your sighs, your smiles. And so when you see that woman at court, the one who lingers too long at your side, whose fingers brush yours during the lute performance, who says your name like it's holy, you hold her gaze a moment too long, you smile, you say nothing. Because in Tudor England, silence isn't just survival, it's the whole strategy. But what if you didn't have to be silent? What if you could write it down? Your longing, your heat, your curiosity. What if sex itself could be described, drawn, read aloud in shadows? Well, you'd be slipping into the smoky, scandalous world of underground Tudor erotica. Yes, it existed. And next, we're cracking the spine on it. You've spent your whole life being told that sex is shameful, sinful, dangerous, a necessary evil for producing heirs and nothing more. Every sermon reinforces it. Every midwife mutters it. Every soldered girl at market learns it in the way people look at her. And yet somehow you still want to know more. Maybe not to do anything, necessarily, but just to understand what it feels like, what it looks like, why people do it even when they're not supposed to. The whispers behind closed doors aren't enough. The creepy metaphors in religious tracts only confuse you further. You want to see it. And in Tudor England, if you know where to look, and you're willing to risk a scandal, you just might. Because yes, even in a world where sex is wrapped in moral panic and dirty linen, erotica exists. Books, pamphlets, illustrations tucked deep into hidden drawers, filthy verses passed hand to hand in courtly chambers and alehouses alike. You'd never find them on a merchant's bookshelf or a church lectern, but you might find them in the belongings of a bored nobleman, a saucy chambermaid, or a very curious apprentice with access to printing blocks and too much free time. The printing press, after all, is the scandal machine of the age. Here's your historical fact. By the mid-16th century, printed materials were exploding across England. Bibles, yes. Political tracts, sure. But also jest books, bawdy ballads, and risque poetry. Most were technically illegal under morality laws, especially after Henry VIII's proclamations against lewd and lascivious texts. But that didn't stop people from writing them, or reading them, or smuggling them in from the continent. Much of this underground erotica came from Italy or France, where sex had a longer literary leash. Books like The School of Venus, or Pietro Aretino's Sonetti Lussuriosi, a collection of erotic sonnets paired with explicit engravings, found their way into the hands of English readers through merchant routes, noble couriers, and the occasional rogue sailor. And once they arrived, they were copied, borrowed, sometimes badly translated, and eagerly consumed. Of course, there's a difference between art and filth, at least in the eyes of Tudor moralists. Erotica was rarely just about sex. It was also about power, politics and rebellion. To read it was to reject the church's control over your body. To laugh at it was to mock the very idea that desire should be hidden. And to write it, that was a dangerous act of resistance. A middle finger to the confessor. Now here's your fringe fact. One particularly infamous book was a 1520s English pamphlet known as The Secret Mirror, filled with euphemisms so heavy-handed they could bruise you. It described the ploughman's furrow, the velvet pipe, and the gates of Venus, all delivered in a tone of mock-serious reverence. Was it erotic? Sort of. Was it hilarious? Absolutely. Half the appeal was the absurdity. Imagine reading dirty limericks written by someone trying to sound like a bishop. It was both forbidden fruit and farce. Illustrated woodcuts were another form of illicit pleasure. Though crude by modern standards, some were surprisingly detailed, depicting couples in positions you'd never find in a marriage manual. These were often hidden between the pages of normal books or pasted behind cabinet doors. Servants who worked in noble houses sometimes got their hands on them and passed them around like treasured relics, each smudged corner evidence of how many hands and eyes they'd travelled through. But let's not pretend it was all harmless fun. Getting caught with this stuff could ruin you. There were laws against blasphemous or obscene publications, and under Mary I's reign, religious crackdowns made even mild sexual writing risky. If a woman was found reading erotica, she could be accused of moral corruption or witchcraft. If a man was caught distributing it, he might face public punishment, fines, or imprisonment. Yet the stuff still moved quietly, steadily, and with a kind of sly defiance. There's a scholarly debate about who consumed this content and why. Some argued it was mainly for men, young, rowdy, literate and bored. Others point to female readers and writers who found in these texts a space to explore desire without punishment. Erotic letters between women, naughty poems written in the margins of herbals, even bawdy plays performed in back rooms of inns suggest that curiosity wasn't confined by gender. Everyone, it seems, wanted a peek behind the curtain, and that desire often came with deep contradictions. You might be aroused and ashamed in the same breath. You might laugh, then panic. You might hide a page beneath your mattress and lie awake wondering if you've doomed your soul, because even if no one else knows, you do. You've seen something you weren't supposed to. You've imagined your body doing things the priest would never describe. You've felt something that can't be confessed without consequences. And still, you go back. You sneak another page, another rhyme, another crude drawing, because something in you needs it. Not just the stimulation, but the possibility. That sex could be something other than terror and duty. That it could be funny, playful, mutual, maybe even joyful, that someone somewhere thought it was worth writing about. Not to shame or silence, but to explore. So you keep the book hidden. You memorise the parts that make your stomach flutter. You repeat a line to yourself while stirring the soup, just to feel like you've stolen something valuable from a world that told you nothing belonged to you. Your thoughts become your own form of resistance. Your curiosity, a quiet revolution. Because in a society where sex is defined by pain, punishment and power, the simple act of imagining pleasure is almost radical. And yet there's one more frontier where sex breaks beyond curiosity and into catastrophe, when love and lust become illnesses. Emotional, physical, fatal. From lovesickness to syphilis, it's time to look at how desire in Tudor England could actually literally kill you. Love makes your chest ache. That's normal, right? A little sighing at the window, a flutter in your belly when they walk by, a few lost hours scrawling their name in the dirt with a stick. But what if it doesn't stop? What if the ache spreads down your ribs, into your lungs, your bones? What if you stop eating, stop sleeping? What if the feeling becomes so heavy, so physical that your body begins to fail? In Tudor England, they had a name for this, lovesickness. And yes, they believed it could kill you. In a world where medical science was just advanced enough to be wildly wrong, doctors and philosophers actually studied romantic obsession as a legitimate disease. Love wasn't just a feeling, it was a humoral imbalance. Too much black bile, not enough phlegm, too many unspent passions choking the organs. If you were caught in a cycle of longing and unfulfilled desire, your entire body could break down. You might waste away, faint, hallucinate. In extreme cases, people even died from heartbreak, from lust, from the sheer agony of wanting someone you couldn't have. Here's your historical fact. In 1576, English physician Timothy Bright published a treatise of melancholy in which he described lovesickness as a form of madness. Victims experienced wild imaginings, deep sighs, sudden paleness, feverish skin, and loss of appetite. Treatment, prayer, poetry, distraction, or, if all else failed, leeches. Yes. Bloodletting was seen as a way to relieve the pressure of erotic obsession, because if your passions couldn't be satisfied, they needed to be drained. And it wasn't just young maidens dreaming about dashing squires. Men too were diagnosed with lovesickness, especially if they lost a lover or were denied marriage to a desired partner. It became a trope in plays and literature. The pining suitor, the pale lady at the window, the tragic ending, brought on by feelings too powerful to survive. Shakespeare's characters drop like flies from this stuff. Romeo and Juliet? Classic case, literal double fatality. But not all love kills you with longing. Some kills you with infection. Enter syphilis, known to the Tudors as the French disease, because naturally they blamed the French for everything. It also went by other charming names depending on where you were: the Neapolitan disease, the Spanish itch, or in polite company, simply the pox. Whatever you called it, it was everywhere. And it was terrifying. Here's your fringe fact. Syphilis likely first arrived in Europe around 1495, just before the Tudor period kicked into full swing, possibly brought back by sailors from the New World. Its early outbreaks were absolutely catastrophic. Skin ulcers, flesh that sloughed off, teeth falling out, noses collapsing inward. People were rotting alive. It was known to disfigure the face, warp the bones, cause blindness, and in later stages, destroy the mind. Victims might go mad with hallucinations and violent rages before finally dying in agony. And yet people kept having sex, because of course they did. At brothels, in alleyways, in noble chambers behind locked doors, desire always found a way. What changed was the level of fear. People began inspecting each other, watching for signs, pimples, rashes, odd smells, sudden silence. Rumours flew faster than infection, and if someone was discovered to have the pox, exile, sometimes from the town, sometimes from society itself. Treatment options were, as usual, equal parts horrifying and useless. The most popular was mercury, applied as a salve or taken as a pill. A night with Venus, they said, a lifetime with mercury. The irony being that mercury itself is toxic and often did more harm than good. Victims lost hair, teeth, even their minds thanks to heavy metal poisoning. But since the sores sometimes went away afterward, people called it a cure. A very expensive, very temporary, very deadly cure. Of course, for women, the consequences of infection were even worse. If a sex worker contracted the disease, she might be imprisoned, whipped, or executed, accused of spreading sin and death. Never mind that she likely had no choice in her profession. Noble women who caught it from their husbands suffered in silence, blamed for their own misery, often disfigured, and hidden away. And pregnant women? If infected, they often passed the disease to their babies in the womb, leading to miscarriage, deformity, or infant death, which meant the punishment of syphilis could stretch across generations. There's a scholarly debate over how widespread syphilis actually was in England during the Tudor period. Some argue it was epidemic. Others claim the worst outbreaks were contained to major cities like London. What's not debated is the fear. Every new sore, every sudden fever, every rash sparked panic. You never knew if you were experiencing a common illness or the slow unravelling of your entire body. And there was no privacy, no confidentiality. If word got out, your reputation, your livelihood, your life could be destroyed. And yet oddly, this didn't lead to widespread sexual abstinence. The church preached harder, yes. Moralists shouted louder. But people continued to risk it, driven by passion, curiosity, or simple loneliness. The risks were real, but so was the hunger, for touch, for connection, for something more than duty and silence. It's worth mentioning that not all stories of love and sex ending in death were literal. Sometimes it was just a slow fading, a woman wasting away in a marriage she didn't choose, a man exiled for pursuing someone he wasn't allowed to love, a servant girl dismissed for being too familiar with the lady of the house. The casualties of desire in Tudor England weren't always buried in graveyards. Some were still walking, breathing, smiling through clenched teeth. And if all this seems unbearably bleak, remember this. People still fell in love, still wrote poems, still carved initials into trees, still held hands when no one was looking. They kissed, touched, whispered, risked everything, not more because they were foolish, but because even in the most repressive eras, desire is defiant. Love doesn't care about laws, it lives in the margins, it survives. And finally, after everything, you're almost at the end of this nightmare masquerading as a sex ed class. Just one more dark corner to explore before we stumble into the light. A final look at the full horrible picture and how lucky you are to be living anywhere but here. So here you are. You've waded through the filth and the fear, the silence and the screams, and what do you have to show for it? A broken hymen, a dead baby, maybe a syphilitic nose, and the looming threat of witchcraft accusations if you so much as smile at the wrong priest. Sex in Tudor England? A total horror show, especially if you were born with a uterus. By now the fantasy is fully dead. The lace, the lute music, the courtly love poems, all just heavy perfumes sprayed over a giant reeking pile of misogyny and misery. Let's step back now and look at the full picture. It's time to stitch all the gore together and ask the big question, how the hell did anyone survive this? You were taught from birth that your body wasn't really yours. It belonged to your father until it belonged to your husband. If you didn't get either, it belonged to the church, or, failing that, to the rumours of your neighbours. Your only value came from how well your body could perform for others, how virginal you looked, how well you bled on the wedding night, how easily you bore children, and how quickly you shut your mouth when pleasure or pain came knocking. And yet somehow you managed to keep existing. That's the part that still astonishes you. Let's zoom out. If you're a woman in Tudor England, you're more likely than not to be illiterate. You're expected to be pious, obedient, and modest. But you're also expected to produce children until you die of it, preferably sons. And if you can't, you're a failure. You're told that sex is shameful but also mandatory. That pleasure is evil unless it produces heirs. That if you enjoy your own body, you're probably on Satan's payroll. And if you don't enjoy it, you're frigid, broken, suspicious. Here's your final historical fact. During the Tudor period, average life expectancy was around 35 years, and a large chunk of women died in childbirth. That's right, giving birth was one of the leading causes of death for women. Imagine spending your short life being told to produce babies, only to have the process itself kill you, or leave you with fistulas, infections, and constant bleeding. And still, society saw you as just a vessel, a walking cradle, an economic transaction wrapped in skin. Meanwhile, the people writing the laws and sermons were all men who decided what counted as fornication, what counted as marriage, what counted as proof that you deserved punishment. They decided what your body meant. And when your body betrayed you, bled too much or not enough, or bled at the wrong time, you were the problem. They wrote books about your womb wandering the body like a lost ghost. They recommended treatments like vinegar-soaked rags, leeches, and praying harder. And then they wondered why women died so often. Let's not forget the overlapping horror of class. If you were poor, your options were even worse. You might be married off at 14 to a man twice your age. You might be raped by a lord or a priest with no hope of justice. You might give birth on a dirt floor, cut the cord with a kitchen knife, and then go back to work 2 days later. If you were rich, you had servants, sure, but you were still bartered like a cow, just with better shoes. Now here's your fringe fact. Some Tudor women, desperate to control their fertility, used homemade contraceptives that included ingredients like cat dung, honey, and sheep bladder soaked in vinegar. You can't make that up. The options weren't just bad, they were dangerous. Because if you were caught trying to prevent pregnancy, that was another kind of sin. So you gambled on your body, your cycles, your luck. And if it didn't work, you gambled it on your own survival, every single time. And when things went wrong, you were always blamed. Couldn't conceive? Your fault. Miscarried? You probably lifted something heavy or thought a lustful thought. Baby born deformed? Maybe you slept on your side or had bad moral character or ate something strange. These weren't accidents, they were punishments. That's how the world explained everything it didn't understand, and when it ran out of explanations, that's when the witch trial started. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether women in Tudor England were consciously oppressed, or if they accepted these roles as natural. The answer, of course, is messy. Some women did rebel, quietly or not. Some found small power in the roles they were allowed to play. Midwives, herbalists, abbesses, even writers. Others were crushed under the weight of rules they never had a chance to question. But no one made it through without feeling the pressure, the weight of expectation, the danger of visibility. And let's not pretend it was any better for the men, at least not emotionally. They were told to dominate, to perform, to suppress every feeling but rage. They were handed a script too, but unlike women, they got the pen, they got to write the ending. So now you're left sitting in the dark with this full, ugly truth. Sex in Tudor England wasn't just bad, it was weaponized. It was used to control, punish, and destroy. It was a battlefield disguised as a bedroom, a legal contract disguised as a wedding, a death sentence disguised as a miracle. And yet somehow love still flickered through the cracks. Lovers still found each other. Letters were still written. Fingers still touched under heavy tablecloths. People still dared to want more than duty. That, more than anything, is what carried them through. That tiny ember of defiance. That sense that sex didn't have to be suffering forever. That maybe, just maybe, something better was coming. And for you? It has. You don't live there, you're not her. You've survived the trip through plague-eaten bedsheets, brothel back rooms, royal beheadings and vinegar-soaked birth control, and somehow you're still breathing. So take a deep breath. Because in the final chapter we're stepping back into the light. We're wrapping this up with a look at how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Breathe it in, the crisp, uninfected air of not Tudor England. No chamber pots sailing past your window, no ropes under your mattress, no priests with leech jars waiting to rebalance your humours. You've made it. You've survived the full nightmare crawl through the Tudor bedroom, and you are miraculously still emotionally intact. Probably. Maybe. Give it a few therapy sessions. Tonight, in this final stretch, we pull the camera back. We take a long look at everything we've just trudged through. And then we exhale. Because now you know, sex in Tudor England was not just bad. It was systemically bad. It was dangerous, unsanitary, patriarchal to the bone, and actively hostile to women. Especially women who didn't fit the mould. Especially women who felt things. Desire, pain, ambition, confusion. All of it made you suspicious. The church told you your body was shameful. The courts told you it was property. And your husband? He might love you, or use you, or kill you. It depended on the day. The architecture of oppression wasn't hidden. It was built into every room, every rule. The marriage bed was a battlefield. The birthing stool, a guillotine in disguise. Pleasure wasn't just rare, it was erased. And if you dared to pursue it, you were a sinner, a seductress, a witch. If you resisted it, frigid, broken, mad. If you suffered, that was God's will. If you died, well, at least your soul might be saved. Let's line up the receipts. Hygiene was non-existent. Consent was meaningless. Virginity was fetishized beyond reason. Women were blamed for infertility, punished for passion, and sentenced to death for miscarriages. Sex work was criminalized but quietly encouraged. LGBTQ+ identities didn't have names, only punishments. Medical knowledge was a tangled mess of superstition and misogyny. And childbirth? A coin toss between life and death. All of this under the watchful, judgmental eye of a society that gave men all the tools and women all the scars. And yet, women survived. Not all, not most, but some. And the ones who did, they knew things. Midwives passed down herbal knowledge that saved lives. Widows manoeuvred social networks to protect themselves. Nuns found intellectual and spiritual freedom within convent walls, until Henry VIII smashed the doors down, of course. Sex workers formed quiet communities of mutual care. Lovers, secret, forbidden, queer, who carved out spaces of joy where none were allowed. Even within the horror show there was humanity, defiance, grit. Here's your final historical fact. By the end of the Tudor era, the cracks in the system were already showing. Women were writing, publishing, arguing back. In 1609, just after Elizabeth I's death, the first known English midwifery manual written by a woman was printed. It was the faintest glimmer of something new, a world in which women might speak for themselves, even about the things that hurt the most. Now, your last fringe fact, just to sweeten this final stretch. Some aristocratic women in the Tudor period collected erotic poems, hidden in journals, passed around in noble circles like gossip dipped in ink. Not all women were passive. Some read, some wrote, some laughed secretly and rebelliously at the same things that today make us blush and commirk. It's a reminder that even under the weight of centuries, the human urge to understand, to feel, to connect, it never dies. And that brings us to today. You sit in a world where sexual knowledge, while still flawed and messy, is infinitely freer. You can Google things, talk about consent, learn about pleasure, read books by women, for women. You can question norms, choose partners, choose yourself. That doesn't mean the struggle is over. It just means the battlefield has changed. The scars are different now, but they're still there. And so we ask, how far have we come, and how far is left to go? Because even now, echoes of Tudor thinking cling to our bones. Virginity myths still float around like stale incense. Women's pain is still undertreated, under-researched, under-respected. Purity culture, dress codes, slut-shaming, body policing, it's all dressed up in modern clothing, but it's got Tudor roots. Every time someone asks what a victim was wearing, or shames a girl for being easy, or silences a survivor, we're still dragging Tudor chains behind us. But unlike them, we can talk about it. We can read, learn, change. Consent is now a word that matters. So is choice, so is pleasure. We've pulled the curtain back. We've named the things that were once too dangerous to say out loud. That's not nothing. That's survival too. So if this journey left you a little rattled, good. It should. You now understand something most history books won't say outright. The past was not quaint. It was cruel. Sex was not romantic. It was rigged. And women in particular carried the weight of it all, through blood and fire and silence and song. But you're here now, and that's the miracle. You listened, you learned, you made it through. So go ahead, turn off the light, let the hum of your fan replace the clatter of hooves and chamber pots. Let your blanket cocoon around you like armour against everything we just crawled through. Rest easy, knowing you'll never have to give birth on a dirt floor, or prove your virginity with a bloodstained sheet, or be accused of witchcraft for loving the wrong person, or die from unwashed lust. At least, not unless you're really unlucky. And now, finally, you get to close the book. You've walked through plague-struck alleys and blood-slick birthing stools. You've crouched in courtly shadows while queens lost their heads and brothel workers lost everything else. You've heard the cries of girls forced into silence, of women punished for pleasure, of love so forbidden it had to live inside hidden letters and passing glances, and through it all you've carried the same question. How did anyone survive this? Here's the quiet truth, many didn't, but some did, and they passed their survival down in whispers and songs, in journals with worn corners, in stories told behind shuttered windows. Every inch of progress you enjoy now came at the cost of someone else's suffering, someone else's silence, someone else's body. That doesn't make you guilty, but it does make you a witness. And maybe, if you're the sort of person who stuck with me through 25 blood-soaked chapters of historical horror, it also makes you the kind of person who won't let those stories disappear. So let that fan hum, let the night be quiet, let your body be yours, without apology or fear. And the next time someone romanticizes simpler times, maybe offer them a small reminder. Simpler doesn't mean kinder, quieter doesn't mean safer. And history, despite all the ruffles and candlelight, was never as innocent as they'd like to believe. You made it to the end, for real this time. So close your eyes, slow your breath, and let the ghosts of the past drift back into the shadows. You are not her, you're free.